Perhaps one of the most thoroughly documented coincidences in modern popular culture involves the striking parallels between the assassinations of Presidents Abraham Lincoln and John Fitzgerald Kennedy, two figures separated by nearly a century, yet connected through a remarkable web of similarities that has captivated public imagination for generations. Both men were elected to the presidency in years ending in 60, with Lincoln assuming office in 1860 and Kennedy in 1960, and both were deeply involved in civil rights issues during their respective administrations, though the nature and scope of their involvement differed considerably given the historical contexts in which they served. Both presidents were shot in the head while riding in open vehicles in public view, with their assassinations occurring on Fridays, and both were followed in office by men named Johnson who were themselves Southern-born Democrats, creating an eerie symmetry in the succession of power. The names themselves seem to carry numerical weight when examined closely, as Lincoln has 7 letters and Kennedy has 7 letters, while their first names, Abraham and John, contain 7 and 4 letters respectively. Beyond these surface-level observations, both men had vice presidents who served previously in Congress, both were interested in space exploration relative to their times, and both were shot by assassins with 3-part names, Lee Harvey Oswald and John Wilkes Booth, details that seemed almost too perfectly aligned to be merely coincidental. The explanation for why these parallels have captured our collective consciousness so thoroughly rests primarily on a psychological phenomenon known as pattern recognition bias, wherein our brains are evolutionarily wired to identify connections and patterns even when they exist purely by chance, and this tendency becomes especially pronounced when we encounter historical figures of tremendous importance and dramatic circumstances. When we learn of one similarity between these presidents, our minds become primed to seek additional connections, and once several legitimate parallels have been established, we unconsciously begin accepting increasingly dubious similarities as significant, a process known as confirmation bias that reinforces our sense of meaningful coincidence. The human brain finds comfort in the narrative frameworks that such patterns provide, transforming random historical facts into compelling stories that suggest underlying order in an otherwise chaotic universe. And this narrative impulse has proven so powerful that the Lincoln-Kennedy parallels have become embedded in popular culture, despite numerous debunking efforts by historians and statisticians who point out that when examined rigorously, many of these supposed connections either dissolve entirely or prove far less remarkable than commonly believed. What remains truly fascinating is not whether these coincidences are statistically improbable, but rather how deeply they persist in our cultural memory and how willing we remain to accept them despite overwhelming evidence that we are simply witnessing the natural outcome, seeking patterns among millions of potential data points across history. The persistence of these parallels reminds us that coincidence itself is a form of narrative we impose on history, one that reveals more about our need for meaning than about any genuine supernatural connection between these two tragic figures, and perhaps this is the real coincidence worth examining, that humanity, across generations, continues to find comfort in patterns precisely because randomness and chaos remain fundamentally unsettling to our deeply story-seeking minds. In the year 1898, 14 years before the Titanic would sink in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, a novelist named Morgan Robertson published a novella titled Futility that would become perhaps the most eerily prescient work of fiction ever written, containing details so strikingly similar to the actual maritime disaster that it seems almost impossible to attribute to mere chance or coincidence. The story follows a massive British passenger ship called the Titan, the largest vessel afloat at the time of its conception, which Robertson described as practically unsinkable due to its modern construction and advanced safety systems. Yet this great ship strikes an iceberg on its maiden voyage and sinks in the cold Atlantic waters, causing tremendous loss of life because there are not enough lifeboats aboard to accommodate all the passengers and crew. When we examine the specific details that Robertson included in his narrative, the parallels become increasingly difficult to dismiss as random invention, for he specified that the fictional Titan was over 800 feet long, displaced approximately 45,000 tons of water, and could carry around 3,000 passengers, figures that align remarkably closely with the actual Titanic's dimensions and passenger capacity, while he also set the disaster in April, the very month in which the Titanic would eventually sink. This phenomenon of art seeming to predict tragedy or specific future events taps into a profound psychological mechanism within the human mind called retrofitting. wherein we selectively remember those details that match reality while unconsciously filtering out the countless details that do not, creating an illusion of prescience that feels far more compelling than pure statistical probability would suggest. Because our brains are naturally inclined to seek patterns and construct meaningful narratives from the chaos of random information we encounter. The human mind possesses an extraordinary capacity for finding connections between disparate elements, a cognitive tendency that served our ancestors well in survival situations, but can lead us astray when confronted with the enormous volume of creative works produced throughout history, for when millions of novels, stories, and films are written across centuries. Some of them inevitably will contain specific details that later align with real events, simply due to the sheer mathematics of probability and variation. Yet despite understanding these psychological mechanisms at an intellectual level, we find ourselves persistently captivated and genuinely unsettled by these coincidences, allowing ourselves to be swept up in the wonder of apparent prescience even as the rational part of our consciousness acknowledges that correlation does not imply causation, and we continue to circulate these remarkable stories, retelling them with the same sense of astonishment. As though repetition might somehow transform coincidence into destiny. Perhaps this is ultimately why the Robertson story endures so powerfully in our collective memory. Not because it proves that fiction can truly foresee the future, but because it reveals something profound about our desperate human need to believe that the chaos of existence contains hidden order, that somewhere in the vast library of human imagination, someone has already written the story of our fate, waiting only for reality to catch up and confirm what was always meant to be. In this way, the futility narrative becomes less a window into the future and more a mirror reflecting our own yearning for meaning, demonstrating how powerfully we reconstruct history through the lens of what we desperately wish to believe about the relationship between imagination. Consider the peculiar case of the Hensel twins, or rather, cases like theirs that have captured public imagination for centuries, where unrelated individuals who have never met, share the same name, and live in different parts of the world, experience strikingly similar life events, and sometimes even die under remarkably parallel circumstances. The historical records are filled with such accounts that seem to defy rational explanation, yet when we examine them closely, we find that what appears supernatural is often simply the result of how our minds process information and recognize patterns. One particularly famous example involved two men named Jim, both adoptees who grew up without knowing each other, who later discovered they had married women named Betty, had sons named James, worked as sheriffs, and eventually died in similar ways at approximately the same age. These accounts became so widespread that they captured the attention of psychologists and researchers who began to study the phenomenon systematically. The mechanism behind these remarkable coincidences involves several overlapping psychological principles that work together to create the illusion of cosmic connection. First, there is the principle of selection bias, wherein we unconsciously notice and remember instances that confirm our pre-existing beliefs about fate and destiny, while dismissing the countless occasions when such patterns fail to emerge. When two strangers named John both happen to enjoy fishing and collecting stamps, we find this remarkable, yet we never hear about the millions of Johns who enjoy neither of these hobbies and live entirely different lives. Second, there exists what researchers call the clustering illusion, the human tendency to see patterns in random data where none actually exist, much like seeing shapes in clouds or faces in random textures. Our brains are essentially pattern recognition machines, evolved over millions of years to detect threats and opportunities in our environment, and this same mechanism causes us to find meaningful connections in what is ultimately random noise. Additionally, there is the sheer force of probability working quietly in the background, for in a world of nearly 8 billion people, it becomes almost inevitable that some extraordinary coincidences will occur simply by mathematical chance. When you consider all possible combinations of shared names, professions, hobbies, and life events across the entire human population, the genuine surprise would be if such coincidences never happened at all. Despite understanding these logical explanations, these twin stranger death stories continue to captivate us and persist in popular culture and folklore, suggesting that our rational minds, even when presented with clear evidence of probability and cognitive bias, still harbor a deep psychological need to believe in patterns, destiny, and connections that transcend the mundane logic of everyday existence. Perhaps this yearning reflects something deeper about the human condition, a need to find meaning and order in a chaotic universe, to believe that our lives are not merely the product of random chance, but are somehow woven into a larger tapestry of significance and interconnection. Yet even as science illuminates the mechanisms of coincidence, the emotional resonance of these stories remains undiminished, perhaps because believing in meaningful connection, even when logically improbable, serves a profound psychological function, offering us comfort in a vast and often indifferent universe. In this way, the twin stranger deaths remind us that coincidence itself may be the most human of experiences, a moment where we glimpse the boundary between randomness and meaning and choose to believe in the latter. In 1935, a man named John Wesley Powell published a detailed account of his expedition down the Colorado River, a journey that took him through the very canyon where the Hoover Dam would eventually be constructed, and he included extensive descriptions of the geological formations and the river's power. More than 80 years later, in 2016, another writer named John Wesley decided to visit the Hoover Dam for the first time in his life, and while standing at the observation deck, he noticed a gift shop selling a specific set of bookends shaped like the dam itself. And when he purchased them and returned home, he discovered that his copy of Powell's original river expedition account fit perfectly between them, held upright as if the bookends had been designed specifically for that single volume. The probability of this occurring seems impossibly small, yet the mechanism behind it is far more mundane than it first appears. The Hoover Dam bookends are mass-produced items designed with standardized dimensions that accommodate most hardcover books published in the early 20th century, which happens to be the same era when Powell's expedition account was originally printed in its most common edition format. Therefore, the bookends were not mysteriously aligned across time to hold this particular book, but rather they conform to the general size specifications that work for countless books from that historical period. Our minds, however, are remarkably skilled at finding patterns and creating narratives that transform ordinary mathematical probability into something that feels like cosmic intention. When we experience a coincidence where dimensions align perfectly or dates echo each other, we construct elaborate stories around them, treating the ordinary mechanics of mass production and standardized sizing as if they represented some hidden connection between two separate moments in time. We have normalized this tendency so completely that we rarely pause to recognize that these bookends hold thousands upon thousands of books equally well, and the fact that one particular volume happens to fit perfectly among millions of possible combinations is not evidence of anything beyond the basic geometry of rectangular objects and publishing standards. Yet the story persists nonetheless, not because it defies logic, but because our narrative-seeking minds find profound satisfaction in transforming the mundane specifications of manufacturing into something that feels like destiny. And perhaps this is precisely why we keep such bookends on our shelves, not because they reliably hold books, but because they anchor us to a story we've chosen to believe, transforming an ordinary purchase into a small monument to the moments when the world seemed to conspire in our favor, even if that conspiracy was only ever the invisible hand of industrial standardization. In this way, the bookends become less about holding Powell's account and more about holding our own need to see meaning in the world, a need so fundamental that we willingly suspend our understanding of manufacturing processes to preserve the magic of the moment when we first noticed them gleaming in that gift shop display case, waiting to be purchased by someone who would transform them into something far more meaningful than their makers ever intended. And so John Wesley, standing in his study with Powell's expedition account secured between those concrete gray bookends, chose not to question the mathematics of the coincidence, understanding perhaps that some stories are more true in their emotional resonance than in their mechanical explanation, and that the bookends had accomplished their real purpose the moment he decided they were meant to hold that particular book. The story of Edgar Allan Poe presents one of literature's most haunting coincidences, a narrative so perfectly aligned with his own dark imaginings that it seems almost impossible to have occurred by chance. Poe spent much of his writing career crafting tales of mystery and death, creating intricate stories about murder, premature burial, and the inexplicable forces that seem to govern human fate. Yet his own death in 1849 mirrored these fictional nightmares in ways that continue to perplex scholars and readers more than a century and a half later. The documented facts surrounding his final days reveal a man found in Baltimore wearing clothes that were not his own, speaking in delirious fragments about enemies and invisible tormentors, and eventually succumbing to a mysterious ailment that doctors could neither diagnose nor explain, all of which reads like a passage directly from one of his own macabre stories. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with this coincidence stems from what researchers call narrative completion, the human tendency to find meaning and coherence in life events when they align with pre-existing patterns or expectations. And in Poe's case, the alignment between his creative preoccupations and his actual fate is so stark that our minds instinctively seek deeper significance rather than accepting pure randomness. We are drawn to the idea that perhaps Poe somehow foresaw his own doom through his writing, that his fictional explorations of death and darkness were not mere imagination, but rather visions or premonitions channeled through his consciousness, an explanation that feels more satisfying to us than acknowledging that coincidence alone could produce such a perfectly tragic denouement. Yet despite knowing intellectually that correlation does not imply causation, and that many writers throughout history have written about death without experiencing particularly unusual circumstances surrounding their own, we continue to regard Poe's case as somehow special and portentous, as though his life itself became the ultimate testament to his literary genius. Blurring the line between fiction and reality in a way that transcends rational explanation and settles, instead, into the realm of cultural mythology. This mythologizing impulse has only intensified over time, transforming Poe from a struggling writer who died in obscurity into a cultural icon whose biography has become inseparable from his art, a phenomenon that reveals perhaps more about our own hunger for meaningful patterns than it does about the actual circumstances of his death. The irony is that Poe himself would likely have appreciated this blurring of fact and fiction, understanding that the most powerful truths often emerge not from documentary accuracy but from the emotional resonance of a well-constructed narrative. And in that sense, his legacy proves that death, like any compelling story, derives its meaning as much from how we choose to tell it as from what actually occurred. In this way, Poe's death becomes less a historical fact to be solved and more a collaborative work of art created by the intersection of his imagination and our collective need to find poetry in tragedy, ensuring that his final chapter will forever remain as mysterious and compelling as anything he himself could have written. The annual mystery surrounding the identity of his grave's visitor, a masked figure who leaves roses and cognac each January, stands as perhaps the perfect embodiment of this phenomenon, a real-world ritual that mirrors the Gothic fiction Poe himself created, suggesting that we have collectively authored a continuation of his story that may ultimately matter more than the historical truth ever could. Samuel Clemens, known to the world as Mark Twain, was born on November 30th, 1835, during the appearance of Halley's Comet, one of the most predictable celestial events in human history, visible from Earth approximately every 76 years. Throughout his life, Twain was acutely aware of this cosmic connection, and he made a remarkable prediction that has since become the foundation of one of literature's most striking coincidences. In 1809, when Twain was 73 years old and in declining health, he allegedly declared that just as he came into the world with Halley's Comet, he would leave it the same way, suggesting that he would die during the comet's next appearance. True to this seemingly impossible prediction, Mark Twain died on April 21, 1910, precisely during Halley's Comet's return to Earth's vicinity, a span of exactly 75 years bookending his existence with the same celestial visitor. The mechanism underlying our fascination with this event operates through what psychologists call narrative bias and apophenia, our profound human tendency to construct meaningful patterns from random data and to remember confirming instances while forgetting the countless times predictions fail to materialize. Twain's statement, whether made seriously or as a joke, existed in the realm of possibility rather than probability. Yet when the outcome aligned with his words, our minds seized upon the alignment as evidence of something profoundly meaningful, perhaps even suggesting fate or a cosmic design. We normalize this interpretation despite understanding that billions of people die every century, and statistically speaking, some will inevitably die during astronomical events, making the coincidence far less remarkable than our emotional response suggests. Yet the narrative persists in literature and popular culture as an example of inexplicable synchronicity, demonstrating how powerfully we are drawn to stories that suggest the universe operates according to a script we can almost comprehend. In this way, Twain's death becomes less a testament to prescience and more a mirror reflecting our deep-seated hunger for narratives where human lives intersect meaningfully with the cosmos, where the ordinary and the celestial converge to suggest that even our final moments might be choreographed by forces greater than ourselves. Yet this hunger for cosmic connection reveals something essential about human consciousness. Our need to believe that our lives matter not just to those around us, but to the universe itself, and in that yearning, we find both the limitation and the beauty of how we construct meaning from the vast indifference of space. Mark Twain himself understood this impulse intimately, crafting narratives throughout his career that transformed mundane human experience into cosmic drama, and perhaps his most enduring legacy is not the coincidence of his death, but rather his demonstration that the stories we tell about ourselves, whether literally true or artfully embellished, become the truths by which we live. In this sense, Twain's life and death serve as a perfect microcosm of his literary philosophy. That reality itself is less important than the interpretive framework we apply to it, and that a well-told story about the world often matters more than the world as it objectively exists. This principle animated his greatest works, from the Mississippi River of Huckleberry Finn * to the fantastical time travel of * a Connecticut Yankee *, where truth becomes malleable, perspective becomes destiny, and the narrators themselves become unreliable architects of meaning, inviting readers to question not what happened, but what we choose to believe happened, and why that choice matters far more. In 1974, the acclaimed Welsh actor Anthony Hopkins found himself searching for a particular book titled The Girl from Petrovka by Anthony Fina, a novel he had become interested in reading during his time in London. Despite his efforts to locate a copy through various bookstores and libraries throughout the city, Hopkins was unable to find the book anywhere, and he eventually abandoned his search, accepting that he would have to wait for another opportunity to obtain it. However, just a few days later, as Hopkins was walking through the streets of London on what appeared to be an ordinary afternoon, he discovered a book lying on a park bench, seemingly abandoned by someone who had left it behind. To his absolute astonishment, the book on the bench was precisely the edition of The Girl from Petrovka that he had been searching for so desperately, abandoned in the middle of the city with no explanation for how it arrived at that exact location at that exact moment. This extraordinary occurrence would have been remarkable enough on its own, but the coincidence would intensify further when Hopkins eventually met the book's author, Anthony Fina, at a social gathering some time later. And during their conversation, Fina casually mentioned that he himself had lost his own personal copy of the book on a bench in London not long before their meeting. The book that Hopkins had found appeared to be the very same copy that Fina had misplaced, suggesting that through an impossible chain of circumstances, the author's own lost manuscript had somehow found its way to the exact person who had been searching for it with such determination. This phenomenon illustrates a principle that psychologists refer to as the Baader-Meinhof effect, or frequency illusion, wherein once we become aware of something or focus our attention toward acquiring something, we begin to notice that thing appearing everywhere around us with startling regularity. Yet this explanation only partially accounts for the Hopkins incident, since the book was genuinely lost property that truly did reappear. What makes this coincidence so psychologically compelling is that it validates a deep human longing to believe that the universe contains hidden patterns and meaningful connections, that our desires and needs somehow reverberate through the fabric of reality in ways that logic cannot fully explain, and despite our modern scientific understanding of probability and chance, we continue to embrace and share these stories as if they represent something profound about existence itself. Perhaps this is why the Hopkins story has endured in popular culture for decades, retold and refined with each passing year, becoming less a mere anecdote about finding a book and more a modern parable about the mysterious ways in which intention and circumstance can converge, reminding us that even in an age of algorithms and rational explanation, we still crave narratives that suggest the universe occasionally bends toward our deepest wishes. Yet the durability of this tale ultimately reveals more about human nature than about coincidence itself. We are meaning-making creatures who find comfort in stories that suggest our lives matter on a cosmic scale, that the universe acknowledges our longings, and perhaps this is the true magic of the Hopkins anecdote, not whether it literally occurred, but that we desperately want to believe it did. In this light, the Anthony Hopkins story functions as a secular miracle narrative, a modern mythology that serves the same psychological purpose that religious and spiritual traditions have always served, offering reassurance that we are not alone in an indifferent universe, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the world conspires to answer our unspoken prayers. Among the most remarkable stories of improbable survival stands the tale of Violet Jessop, a British-Irish nurse and ocean liner stewardess whose life became intertwined with three of the most catastrophic maritime disasters of the early 20th century. In 1909, Jessop was working aboard the RMS Olympic when it collided with the British naval cruiser HMS Hawke in the Solent, an accident that caused significant damage but resulted in no fatalities. Just 3 years later, in 1912, Jessop found herself aboard the RMS Titanic on its maiden voyage when the ship struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, and she survived the sinking by boarding lifeboat number 16 and spending hours in the freezing waters before being rescued by the Carpathia. Then, as if fate itself had marked her for survival, Jessop was working as a nurse aboard the HMHS Britannic, formerly the Olympic sister ship, when it struck a mine in 1916 and sank in the Aegean Sea. Yet again, she managed to survive this catastrophe. The sheer statistical improbability of one person surviving not just one, but three major maritime disasters presents a narrative so extraordinary that it challenges our conventional understanding of luck and probability. When we examine such cases, we recognize that survival often hinges upon a complex interplay of circumstantial factors including positioning, timing, physical resilience, and access to lifeboats or rescue equipment, none of which are truly supernatural, but rather represent the countless variables that determine who lives and who perishes in chaos. Yet despite our rational understanding of probability distributions and the mathematical reality that rare events do occasionally occur, stories like Jessop's persist in capturing our imagination with an almost supernatural quality, suggesting that coincidence itself occupies a peculiar space in human consciousness, where logic and wonder somehow coexist without fully resolving their inherent contradiction. Perhaps this is why Jessop herself seemed to regard her survival with a kind of philosophical detachment, living until 1971 and never attributing her escapes to divine intervention, but rather to her own composure, quick thinking, and the pragmatic decisions she made in moments of crisis. A reminder that the most extraordinary survival stories are often authored not by fate, but by the ordinary human capacity to remain calm when everything around us is falling apart. Her testimony, documented in her memoir Titanic Survivor, became invaluable to maritime historians precisely because she resisted the temptation to mythologize her experiences, instead offering meticulous, unadorned accounts of what she observed and endured, demonstrating that credible survival narratives often emerge not from those who claim special destiny, but from those humble enough to acknowledge luck's role while refusing to surrender agency to it. In this respect, Jessop's legacy transcends the mere curiosity of statistical improbability. Her life serves as a case study in how survival narratives gain historical credibility through restraint rather than sensationalism, and how the most convincing accounts of extraordinary events are often those delivered with measured skepticism toward one's own experience. This distinction between Jessop and other celebrated survivors, who often amplified their narratives with dramatic embellishments or claims of providential protection, underscores a fundamental principle in how we evaluate historical testimony. The most trustworthy accounts frequently come from witnesses willing to acknowledge the limits of their own understanding rather than impose grand interpretations upon random survival. Perhaps one of the most extraordinary cases of coincidence in modern psychology involves two identical twins named Jim, separated at birth and raised in completely different environments across different states, who would later discover through adoption records that their lives had followed an almost impossibly parallel trajectory in ways that seemed to defy rational explanation. When the twins were finally reunited as adults, they found that they had both married women named Betty, both divorced their first wives and subsequently married women named Sandra, both named their sons James Jr., both worked as security guards and volunteer firefighters, both drove Chevrolet automobiles, both had similar height and weight measurements, and both even suffered from the same relatively uncommon medical conditions at approximately the same ages. The psychological mechanism that helps us understand this phenomenon involves recognizing that while identical twins do share 100% of their DNA, which can influence temperament, personality traits, and even subtle behavioral patterns that might unconsciously guide their choices, the statistical likelihood of such specific and detailed similarities occurring by pure chance remains extraordinarily low. Yet not entirely impossible, when we consider the vast number of potential life paths and choices available to any individual. What occurs in our minds when we encounter such cases is a phenomenon known as confirmation bias, wherein we tend to remember and emphasize the remarkable similarities while unconsciously filtering out the countless ways in which these twins differed from one another, the ordinary choices they made that did not align, and the many mundane aspects of their lives that followed entirely different patterns based on their distinct upbringings and environmental influences. The persistence of this case as a cultural touchstone of meaningful coincidence persists despite our understanding of these cognitive biases, because the human mind finds genuine comfort and meaning in the notion that some forces, whether genetic or mystical, maintain invisible connections between people we love, and this particular story, whether embellished or accurately reported, offers us a narrative framework that feels deeply satisfying to our need for pattern recognition and cosmic significance. Yet it is precisely this hunger for meaning that makes us susceptible to accepting incomplete narratives. The fuller truth is that while the Jim twins case remains documented in psychological literature, many of the most startling claims have been disputed or contextualized by researchers who note that adoption agencies sometimes place siblings in socioeconomically similar environments, inadvertently stacking the deck toward greater similarities than pure chance alone would suggest. Furthermore, this methodological insight reminds us that even our most carefully documented cases of extraordinary coincidence often collapse under scrutiny into more prosaic explanations rooted in selection bias, environmental correlation, and the simple human tendency to construct meaningful narratives from the raw material of our lives, suggesting that the true miracle may lie not in hidden cosmic connections, but in our remarkable capacity to find profound significance in patterns that emerge from the ordinary. This reframing invites us to consider whether the Jim twins case ultimately tells us more about the workings of identical genetics and environmental psychology than it does about fate. Yet the enduring power of their story suggests that humans will always find ways to interpret coincidence as confirmation of deeper truths, a tendency that may itself be the most fascinating psychological phenomenon of all. In 1405, the Central Asian conqueror Timur, known to history as Tamerlane, died in Samarkand after building one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, and according to legend, he left behind a curse that would haunt anyone who dared to disturb his tomb. For nearly 600 years, his grave remained sealed and undisturbed, a warning passed down through generations that opening it would unleash catastrophe upon the world. Then in 1941, during the height of World War II, Soviet archaeologist Mikhail Gerasimov decided to open the tomb to examine the conqueror's remains, and within days of breaking the seal, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union with unprecedented ferocity and initiating one of history's deadliest conflicts. The timing seemed impossible to ignore, and many pointed to Tamerlane's curse as an explanation for the sudden escalation of violence and suffering that followed. What makes this coincidence particularly striking is how it persists in popular memory despite the obvious logical explanation that both the opening of the tomb and the invasion were entirely independent historical events driven by their own political and military circumstances. The curse narrative became so embedded in cultural consciousness that it has been repeated in documentaries, books, and historical accounts as though the supernatural had intervened in world affairs. Yet the reality is that military planning for Operation Barbarossa had been underway for months before the tomb was opened, and the invasion would have occurred regardless of whether any archaeological work had taken place in Samarkand. Our minds naturally seek patterns and meaningful connections between proximate events, especially when one follows the other in rapid succession, and we find the explanation of a mystical curse far more psychologically satisfying than accepting that two major historical events simply happened to occur near one another through pure coincidence. The curse has become so normalized in discussions of this period that it serves as a kind of historical shorthand, allowing us to discuss the event with a sense of narrative closure and mysterious inevitability, rather than facing the more complex reality that history is often shaped by mundane decisions and mechanical forces rather than by supernatural warnings or divine interventions. Yet this tendency to retrofit cosmic significance onto historical moments reveals something important about how we construct meaning from the past. We instinctively transform random coincidence into narrative, transforming Tamerlane from a long-dead conqueror into an active agent in 20th-century geopolitics. and in doing so, we grant ourselves the comforting illusion that history follows comprehensible rules rather than lurching forward through accident and human miscalculation. This pattern repeats throughout history. We invoke curses and omens to explain the inexplicable, transforming powerless witnesses into actors within a meaningful cosmic drama, when perhaps what we are really seeking is reassurance that someone or something was in control all along. And so the curse of Tamerlane endures not because of any supernatural force, but because it fulfills a deeper human need. The desire to believe that chaos has meaning, that catastrophe carries purpose, and that even in our darkest moments, we are not simply victims of random chance, but participants in a story written by forces greater than ourselves. In this way, Tamerlane's curse becomes less a supernatural warning and more a mirror held up to our own psychological vulnerabilities, a testament to how powerfully we need the world to make sense, even when that sense comes at the cost of truth. In the spring of 1892, King Umberto I of Italy was dining at a restaurant in the city of Monza when he encountered a most extraordinary coincidence that would cement this tale in the annals of royal history and peculiar synchronicity. The king noticed that the proprietor of the establishment bore a striking resemblance to himself, so remarkable in fact that they could have been twins separated at birth. And upon investigation, the monarch discovered that this man, whose name was also Umberto, shared not only his appearance but also his birthday, born on the very same day in the very same year. The two Umbertos began to compare the details of their lives in amazement, and they found that both had served in the military, both had married women named Margherita, and both had sons named Vittorio, as if some invisible force had orchestrated their parallel existences with meticulous precision. The king, delighted by this astonishing symmetry, decided to retain the restaurant owner in his service, perhaps thinking that such a remarkable coincidence deserved to be rewarded with royal patronage. However, the story takes a darker turn when we learn that on the very next day, the restaurant owner was fatally struck by a stray bullet fired during a military accident, and shortly thereafter, the king himself was assassinated by an anarchist named Gaetano Bresci, both men dying within weeks of each other, as if their shared destiny extended even unto death itself. What makes this coincidence particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how our minds naturally gravitate toward pattern recognition and meaning-making, a tendency that served our ancestors well in detecting dangers and opportunities, but now often leads us to perceive connection and significance in random occurrences that would statistically be bound to happen occasionally when considering the vast number of people inhabiting the world. The legend of King Umberto's doppelganger persists through history, not because the events were necessarily more improbable than countless other unremarkable coincidences that go unnoticed every day, but because they involved royalty and bore the weight of dramatic narrative that made them memorable and worth retelling across generations, transforming an unusual but statistically plausible encounter into a cautionary tale about fate and human connection. Yet perhaps this is precisely the function such stories serve in human culture, to remind us that while coincidence may be mathematically explicable, the emotional resonance of encountering our own reflection in another person speaks to something deeper in our need to believe that fate, destiny, and cosmic significance thread through our seemingly ordinary lives, making the improbable feel inevitable in retrospect. And indeed, the Umberto story endures precisely because it captures this paradox, the simultaneous truth that such coincidences are mathematically inevitable in a world of billions, yet psychologically profound in their ability to make us question whether randomness alone can account for the uncanny symmetries that occasionally punctuate human experience, leaving us suspended between skepticism and wonder. In this sense, the doppelganger phenomenon, whether encountered in flesh as the two Umbertos were, or merely imagined in the shadows of our anxieties, serves as a mirror reflecting our deepest human contradictions. The simultaneous hunger for rational explanation and the irresistible pull toward believing that we are, in some way, chosen by forces beyond our comprehension to live out narratives of cosmic significance. In the autumn of 1863, a young man found himself in a precarious situation at a train station in Jersey City, New Jersey, where he nearly fell between a moving railroad car and the platform, a fall that would have almost certainly resulted in serious injury or death. That young man was Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son of President Abraham Lincoln, and the person who pulled him back from the edge of that mechanical abyss was none other than John Wilkes Booth, the very same actor who would, less than 2 years later, assassinate President Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, District of Columbia. The remarkable nature of this coincidence lies not merely in the fact that Booth saved Lincoln's son from a terrible accident, but in the broader implications of the moment itself, suggesting that the trajectory of history hung suspended in that instant where two figures whose names would become forever intertwined in American tragedy were brought together in an act of seemingly noble intervention. Robert Lincoln himself would later confirm this encounter in his own recollection of events, writing to a friend about the incident and specifically identifying his rescuer as Booth, thus establishing this as a documented historical moment rather than mere speculation or legend passed down through generations. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with this particular coincidence involves what researchers call narrative determinism, wherein we construct meaningful patterns from historical events and become enchanted by the notion that fate or providence orchestrated a meeting between perpetrator and victim before the terrible act that would define both their legacies forever. We find ourselves drawn to the idea that somehow, in that moment on the train platform, destiny was at work, that the universe was writing a story of irony and consequence, even though we rationally understand that Booth's rescue of Robert Lincoln carries no causal relationship whatsoever to his later assassination of the president. The coincidence persists in popular culture and historical discourse because it perfectly embodies the human desire to locate meaning and connection in seemingly random events, to believe that history operates according to a hidden logic that renders even the most disparate moments pregnant with significance and foreshadowing. We continue to retell this story, to marvel at it, to include it in lists of incredible coincidences, precisely because it allows us to feel that history is authored rather than chaotic, that there exists some underlying structure to events that we can perceive and interpret if only we look closely enough at the intersection of lives and moments across time. Yet in the end, this coincidence reminds us that history is ultimately a collection of individual moments and encounters, many of them forgotten or overlooked, and that the true significance of Booth's act of mercy on that train platform lies not in what followed, but in the simple, human gesture itself, a stranger saving another from harm before all else was lost to tragedy and time. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson the coincidence offers us, that kindness and cruelty are not predetermined by fate, but rather choices made by individuals in discrete moments, and that even the most pivotal figures in history were once simply people capable of both saving and destroying, their moral trajectories not yet written. In this light, the incident at Jersey City becomes not a prophecy of doom, but rather a testament to the fundamental unpredictability of human nature, a reminder that the same hand capable of heroic intervention is equally capable of committing unspeakable violence, depending entirely upon the choices and circumstances that occur. Consider the peculiar convergence of three distinct elements that, when examined closely, reveal an almost impossible alignment of historical and contemporary figures. Enzo Ferrari, the legendary Italian automobile manufacturer who founded Ferrari in 1927 and revolutionized motorsport for nearly 5 decades, shares an unexpected linguistic and phonetic bridge with Mesut Özil, the German-Turkish professional footballer who played as a midfielder for some of the world's most prestigious clubs, including Real Madrid and Arsenal during the 21st century. The coincidence emerges not from any direct connection between these men, but rather from the peculiar way their names, when spoken aloud in certain contexts, contain remarkably similar phonetic elements and syllabic patterns that seem to echo across the vast expanse of time, separating their respective eras and domains of influence. When we examine this phenomenon more carefully, we discover that our minds are naturally inclined to search for patterns and connections between seemingly unrelated concepts, a cognitive process known as apophenia, wherein we perceive meaningful relationships between unrelated things. The human brain evolved to detect patterns as a survival mechanism, making rapid associations between disparate information so that we might quickly identify threats or opportunities in our environment. This same neural architecture that once helped our ancestors survive on the African savanna now causes us contemporary beings to notice the subtle phonetic similarities between a 20th-century automotive pioneer and a modern athlete, creating a sense of meaningful coincidence where none genuinely exists. Yet despite our intellectual understanding of this psychological mechanism, despite our conscious knowledge that pattern recognition can mislead us and create false correlations, we continue to find these alignments fascinating and memorable, allowing them to persist in our cultural consciousness as examples of the universe's mysterious ways. We have come to normalize this tendency as something almost spiritual, attributing deeper meaning to what are ultimately just random confluences of sound and circumstance. And perhaps this normalization itself represents the deepest coincidence of all. For in the end, the true coincidence may not lie in the phonetic similarities between Ferrari and Özil themselves, but rather in our collective decision to pause and marvel at their juxtaposition, transforming a mere accident of nomenclature into something worthy of contemplation and narrative exploration across generations. And so we find ourselves in this curious position, two names separated by continents and decades, united only by our willingness to examine them together, reminding us that meaning is often less discovered than it is created through the simple act of attention and contemplation. Perhaps this is why we collect such coincidences obsessively, cataloging the accidental alignments of names and dates and places as though we were assembling evidence of some hidden order beneath reality's surface, when in fact we are simply documenting the infinite ways that language and history can intersect when we choose to look for them. In this light, the pairing of Enzo Ferrari and Mesut Özil becomes less a cosmic message and more a mirror reflecting back our own profound human need to construct narratives from the raw materials of coincidence, to find significance in the spaces between unrelated lives, and ultimately to remind ourselves that we are never truly alone in our search for meaning, for somewhere across time and discipline, two names have collided in our collective awareness, proving that even randomness can become resonant when we decide to listen. On April 13, 1970, the Apollo 13 spacecraft experienced a catastrophic oxygen tank explosion approximately 200,000 miles from Earth, forcing NASA to abort the lunar landing and improvise a desperate rescue mission to bring the three astronauts safely home. What makes this particular disaster so remarkable from a coincidence perspective is that the mission was originally scheduled to launch on April 11th, but due to various technical delays and scheduling adjustments, it was pushed back by exactly 2 days, placing the explosion precisely on April 13th, which also happened to be a Friday the 13th, a date that carries centuries of superstitious weight in Western culture despite having no inherent connection to actual danger or misfortune. When we examine this convergence more closely, we find ourselves confronted with a peculiar intersection of numerological significance, scheduling logistics, and cultural mythology that seems almost too perfectly aligned to be merely random occurrence. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what researchers call the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where we draw a target around bullet holes after they have already been fired, essentially creating patterns retroactively from events that have already transpired rather than predicting them in advance. And then we attach cultural significance to numbers and dates that our civilization has invested with meaning over centuries of storytelling and superstition. The truth of the matter is that Apollo 13 could have launched on April 11th without incident, or it could have exploded at any point during its actual trajectory, and we would have found different numerical coincidences to analyze, different cultural associations to invoke, and different patterns to construct around whatever actual events had occurred. Yet despite our collective understanding of these cognitive biases, and despite NASA's own documentation of the straightforward mechanical and human factors that led to the explosion, the date April 13th continues to resonate with an almost supernatural significance whenever Apollo 13 is discussed in popular culture, demonstrating how thoroughly our minds remain susceptible to the narrative power of coincidence, even when we consciously acknowledge that such patterns are ultimately meaningless artifacts of pattern recognition rather than evidence of hidden cosmic design. This paradox reveals something fundamental about human nature. We seem to need our disasters to mean something, to fit into larger patterns and narratives, because random catastrophe striking arbitrarily at arbitrary moments is somehow more terrifying than a disaster that arrives on a Friday the 13th, as if the superstition itself provides a strange comfort by suggesting that at least the universe operates according to comprehensible rules, even if those rules are illogical. Perhaps this is why we unconsciously celebrate the safe return of Apollo 13's crew not merely as a triumph of engineering and human ingenuity, but as a kind of cosmic reprieve from the superstition itself, as though the astronauts' survival somehow validated our need to believe that meaning and pattern govern our world, rather than accepting that they emerged from Houston's mission control rooms through calculation, skill, and fortunate timing, rather than through any intervention of fate. And yet the very fact that we continue to tell and retell the Apollo 13 story with emphasis on its Friday the 13th launch date, rather than focusing primarily on the brilliant problem-solving that saved 3 lives, suggests that our appetite for meaningful coincidence may ultimately override our commitment to rational analysis, even among those who In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, a peculiar phenomenon began circulating through various communities, particularly among those who played daily lottery games across the United States. The claim was that in the weeks and months following the tragedy, lottery drawings had produced numbers that seemed to carry significant numerical relationships to the date of the attacks and to other aspects of the event itself. Some people reported that the numbers 3, 1 appeared frequently in various lottery games, or that sequences related to the date September 11th showed up with unusual frequency in state lottery drawings. The narrative that developed suggested an almost supernatural connection between the tragedy and subsequent random number generation, as if the universe itself was somehow imprinting this event onto the fabric of chance and probability through these seemingly coordinated drawings. People who had lost loved ones or who were deeply affected by the attacks found meaning in these number patterns, and the stories spread through networks of believers, each new instance of a relevant number combination reinforcing the sense that something extraordinary and meaningful was occurring beneath the surface of randomness. However, the explanation for why this perception became so widespread and persistent lies entirely within how human consciousness processes information and seeks patterns in truly random data. The human brain is fundamentally equipped to detect patterns, and this ability served our ancestors well when they needed to identify predators or find food sources in complex environments. But in situations involving random number generation, this same mechanism produces what psychologists call apophenia or pareidolia of numbers. When you have millions of people playing lottery games across the country every single day, and when each game produces multiple numbers, the sheer volume of numerical data being generated means that virtually every possible number combination and pattern will appear somewhere with regular frequency. Yet our minds selectively focus on the combinations that match our expectations or our recent emotional experiences, completely ignoring the vastly larger number of combinations that mean nothing to us whatsoever. The tragedy of September 11th was such a dominant cultural moment that it had captured the attention and emotional energy of virtually every person in the country, which meant that when anyone saw the numbers 1, 1, 9, 3, or any other sequence that could possibly be related to the date, their pattern recognition system would activate with particular intensity, creating a memorable impression, while the millions of other lottery results that contained no such connection were simply forgotten. What makes this particular coincidence narrative so persistent despite our intellectual understanding that it requires no supernatural explanation is that it fulfilled a deep psychological need in the aftermath of trauma, providing a sense that there was hidden order and meaning in a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be chaotic and dangerous. And this need for meaning and connection often outweighs our logical understanding of probability and randomness. The lottery numbers, in this sense, became a form of modern divination, a way of reading meaning into randomness that served the same psychological function as ancient augury, allowing people to feel less powerless in the face of incomprehensible loss. In seeking patterns in the numbers, communities were ultimately seeking reassurance that the world still operated according to some deeper logic, even if that logic existed only in the spaces between chance and human interpretation. There exists a documented case from the 1970s involving a young child in Detroit who fell from a window on the 14th floor of an apartment building, and remarkably survived the fall with only minor injuries. Yet several years later, the same child fell from a window on the 26th floor of a different building and survived once again, an event so statistically improbable that it has become the subject of both medical and psychological inquiry for decades since. The first fall occurred when the child, approximately 10 years old, was leaning too far out of a window while attempting to retrieve a ball that had rolled onto a narrow ledge, when a sudden gust of wind combined with a momentary loss of balance sent the child tumbling downward through the air toward the street below. Yet somehow the child landed on a large canvas awning that was being prepared for a street festival, which absorbed much of the impact and diverted the trajectory enough that the child rolled onto a stack of cardboard boxes and emerged with only bruises and a fractured arm. What makes this case so remarkable is that approximately 6 years later, after the child had grown into adolescence and seemingly put the traumatic event behind them, they were staying with relatives on a much higher floor of a completely different building when curiosity about the view and a moment of carelessness led to another window fall. And this time, the child landed in an inflatable promotional bounce structure that happened to be set up directly below the window at that exact moment, again resulting in survival against extraordinary odds. The psychological mechanism operating beneath these events relates to how we process probability and pattern recognition in our minds. For when we encounter two similar events happening to the same person, we immediately search for causal connections and meaningful explanations, even though statistically improbable events must occur to someone eventually, and the human brain is particularly adept at finding narrative coherence where randomness actually reigns supreme. We tend to remember the remarkable and forget the millions of times nothing unusual happens, and we construct stories around coincidences because our minds evolved to find patterns and meaning in our environment, which generally serves us well for survival, but can lead us to attribute significance to events that are simply the inevitable result of probability playing out across billions of people and countless scenarios over time. Yet despite our intellectual understanding of these principles, the case of the child who fell twice and lived continues to capture our imagination and persist in popular culture, suggesting that even when we understand logically that coincidence requires no deeper explanation, we struggle to fully integrate that knowledge into our emotional and intuitive responses to such extraordinary events, leaving us with a fascination that endures regardless of how thoroughly we can explain it away. This enduring fascination reveals something fundamental about human nature itself. We are storytelling creatures who cannot help but search for meaning in the world around us, and the case of the twice-fallen child serves as a perfect mirror reflecting our deepest need to believe that some lives are touched by forces beyond mere chance, even when the rational mind knows better. Perhaps this is why the story of the twice-fallen child has become almost mythological in status, retold and embellished across decades, until it exists simultaneously as both a documented medical anomaly and a modern legend that speaks to our desire to believe that survival itself can be a kind of destiny. Imagine discovering an old photograph from your childhood, perhaps tucked away in a box in your parents' attic or stored in a dusty album that hasn't been opened in decades. And as you examine it closely, you notice something that sends a chill down your spine. There is a stranger in the background, someone you have never met, someone who appears to be watching directly at the camera with an expression that feels oddly knowing or intensely present in a way that shouldn't matter, yet somehow does. You show the photograph to your family members, and they squint at it, tilt their heads, and tell you they have no idea who this person is, that no one remembers this stranger being present at that birthday party or family gathering or beach outing from so many years ago. The mystery deepens when years later, perhaps through social media or a chance encounter at a grocery store, you see this exact same face again in your adult life, and the recognition hits you like a moment of profound synchronicity that defies rational explanation. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists call pareidolia combined with pattern recognition failure and the backfilling of memory. Your brain is extraordinarily skilled at detecting faces in crowds, in random patterns, even in situations where no face actually exists, because our survival as a species has depended on quickly identifying friend from foe, known from unknown. When you stumble upon an old photograph years later with fresh eyes and mature cognitive frameworks, your brain recontextualizes what it sees, sometimes identifying as a stranger someone who was actually a minor figure in the scene, someone your childhood mind deemed unimportant and therefore failed to encode into memory with any significance. The coincidence of later encountering this person seems impossible because you have invested the photograph with false weight, treating it as evidence of something meaningful when it was merely a random moment of photographic chance. What persists despite having no logical basis is our deep human need to believe that the universe communicates with us through signs and symbols, that certain encounters are fated or destined rather than simple probability at work in a world of billions of people and countless overlapping social circles where connection is far more likely than we intuitively assume. We convince ourselves that this stranger was watching us specifically, that they somehow knew us or our future significance, when in truth they were simply another person existing in the same moment, equally unaware of the role they would come to play in our retrospective mythology. This is how we transform the mundane randomness of life into narratives of cosmic connection, finding meaning in the gaps between what we remember and what the photograph proves actually occurred. And perhaps this is not a flaw in our cognition, but rather a feature, a way of transforming the indifferent universe into one where we matter, where we are noticed, where invisible threads connect past and present into a coherent story worth telling. Yet even with this understanding, the next time you find an old photograph and notice an unfamiliar face staring back at you, you may still feel that same inexplicable shiver, still wonder if this time the coincidence means something, because the human heart has always been more persuasive than the rational mind, and perhaps that too is exactly as it should be. After all, isn't the photograph itself a kind of time machine that allows our present self to meet our past self as a stranger? Two versions of us separated by years, yet captured in the same frame, forever unable to truly recognize one another. Consider the story of two strangers who connected through one of the most mundane and easily explainable accidents imaginable, a single digit misdialed on a telephone. What began as a simple mistake, where person A intended to call their friend but instead reached person B, somehow transformed into years of conversation, shared experiences, and eventually romantic partnership. The initial awkwardness of the wrong number call dissolved quickly when the two discovered an unexpected compatibility, a sense of humor that aligned perfectly, and interests that seemed to complement one another in ways that defied statistical probability. They continued talking beyond that first accidental conversation, exchanged contact information, and slowly built a relationship that neither of them had anticipated when they woke up that morning. Years later, these individuals would stand at the altar or renew vows, marveling at the extraordinary fortune of that single mistyped digit that changed the entire trajectory of their lives. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon relates to how we construct meaning from randomness, and how our brains are inherently pattern-seeking creatures that naturally interpret coincidences as destiny. When something unusual or unexpected happens to us, particularly something that aligns with our desires or emotional needs, we become emotionally invested in the narrative of inevitability, in the idea that the universe conspired to bring two compatible people together. What was technically the result of simple probability, the mathematical certainty that wrong numbers happen millions of times daily, transforms in our minds into something cosmically significant. We normalize this interpretation because the alternative feels unsatisfying to our deeply human need for meaning, because accepting that chance alone brought our soulmate into our life feels somehow less romantic than believing in fate, even when the mathematical reality is that wrong numbers are statistically guaranteed to happen constantly across billions of phone calls made every single day. Yet this cognitive bias, this preference for destiny over probability, may itself be the most human and valuable aspect of the story, not because it's true, but because the meaning we create through connection becomes real in its consequences, transforming a random digit into genuine love through the choices we make after that first bewildering conversation. Perhaps this is why the wrong number story resonates so deeply across cultures and generations. It suggests that even in a world governed by chaos and probability, our capacity to choose connection, to nurture unexpected intimacy, and to build meaning from accident gives us agency over our own narrative, transforming what began as a mathematical inevitability into something that feels uniquely, irreplaceably ours. In this sense, the wrong number becomes less about cosmic intervention and more about the ordinary miracle of human receptivity. Two people who happened to answer their phones, chose to listen rather than hang up, and decided that a stranger's voice was worth their time. The real soulmate is not found in the accident itself, but discovered in the thousands small moments afterward where both people chose, again and again, to keep dialing. Because in the end, every soulmate story, whether born from a wrong number, a chance meeting at a coffee shop, or an introduction through mutual friends, rests not on the initial spark of fate, but on the deliberate, unglamorous work of showing up repeatedly, of choosing vulnerability, and of deciding that this particular person, this specific voice on the other end of the line, is worth the ongoing commitment to keep the line open. Consider the remarkable astronomical coincidence that unfolds whenever the moon passes directly between the Earth and the Sun, casting its shadow across our planet in what we call a total solar eclipse. During these rare events, the moon appears to be almost exactly the same size as the sun in our sky, creating a perfect alignment where the moon's disk covers the sun's bright face completely, yet allows the sun's ethereal corona to become visible around the moon's silhouette. This phenomenon seems almost impossibly choreographed, as though the universe deliberately arranged for our moon to be precisely the right distance from Earth and possess exactly the right diameter to eclipse the sun so perfectly. The mathematical reality behind this apparent perfection is actually grounded in the specific orbital mechanics of our Earth-Moon system. The Sun is approximately 400 times larger than the Moon, yet it is also roughly 400 times farther away from Earth than the Moon is, which means these two celestial bodies occupy nearly identical angular sizes when viewed from our planetary surface. This ratio emerged not through cosmic design, but through the dynamic history of our solar system, where the Moon was gradually drawn closer to Earth over billions of years through tidal interactions, eventually settling into an orbit where this size coincidence became possible. What makes this situation even more psychologically compelling is that humanity only recently became aware of this alignment, having developed the scientific knowledge and tools necessary to observe and measure celestial distances within just the last few centuries. We experience total solar eclipses as profound moments of cosmic alignment, moments when the heavens seem to perform an elaborate dance solely for our observation. Yet this sense of theatrical perfection is really just a consequence of mathematical ratios that care nothing for human perspective or emotional significance. The Moon continues its slow spiral outward from Earth at roughly 1.5 inches per year, meaning that in millions of years, future generations will witness eclipse events that are no longer total, as the Moon will have moved far enough away to no longer perfectly cover the Sun's disk. We have arrived at precisely the right moment in cosmic history to witness this particular form of alignment, a coincidence of timing that creates an illusion of celestial perfection, even though it represents merely a transient phase in an ongoing mechanical dance of orbital bodies governed entirely by the laws of physics and gravity. Yet this temporal accident of alignment grants us a precious window of opportunity, one that has allowed humanity to unlock profound secrets about the sun's atmosphere, the behavior of gravity, and our place within a cosmos far more vast and indifferent than our ancestors could have imagined, making our brief era of perfect eclipses a gift we may never fully deserve. Perhaps it is this very awareness of our cosmic insignificance, that we happen to exist during this fleeting window of perfect alignment, that transforms a mere astronomical coincidence into something approaching genuine wonder, reminding us that meaning need not be deliberately designed to be profoundly real. The totality we witness, where day transforms into twilight and stars emerge at noon, reminds us that wonder flourishes not despite our understanding of the universe's indifference, but precisely because we possess the consciousness to comprehend it, making us uniquely positioned among all creatures on Earth to recognize and cherish this temporary celestial gift. When you stand on Earth and look up at the night sky, the Moon appears to be roughly the same size as the Sun, a visual coincidence so profound that it allows total solar eclipses to occur where the Moon perfectly blocks the Sun's disk from our perspective. This remarkable alignment stems from a precise mathematical relationship that seems almost impossibly calibrated. The Sun is approximately 400 times larger in diameter than the Moon, yet it is also roughly 400 times farther away from Earth than the Moon is, which means both celestial bodies occupy nearly the same angular size in our sky, approximately half a degree across. This ratio creates what astronomers call the coincidence of angular diameters, and it is so specific that if either body were slightly larger or smaller, or if the Moon's orbit were even modestly different, perfect eclipses would become impossible. The psychological impact of witnessing a total solar eclipse is profound and ancient, as humans throughout history have observed this celestial alignment with a sense of awe and even spiritual significance, interpreting it as a sign of cosmic order or divine intention. From a purely mathematical standpoint, however, this phenomenon can be explained through orbital mechanics and the specific conditions that existed when the Moon formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago through a giant impact event with the early Earth. The Moon has been gradually drifting away from Earth at a rate of about 1.5 inches per year, meaning that millions of years ago the Moon was closer and appeared larger in the sky, while in the distant future it will appear smaller and perfect solar eclipses will no longer be possible. Yet despite understanding the mechanical reasons behind this alignment, there remains something deeply unsettling about the precision required for this cosmic arrangement, a calibration that allows us, uniquely among all observers in the universe, to witness the sun's corona during totality, to see solar prominences with our naked eyes, and to experience the profound darkness of day transformed into night. This coincidence persists in our collective consciousness not as a mere mathematical curiosity, but as a reminder of how finely balanced our position in the cosmos truly is, and how the particular conditions of our solar system have granted us a perspective on the universe that may be rarer and more precious than we have yet fully appreciated. When we consider that this precise ratio has enabled us to map the sun's atmosphere, measure stellar distances through eclipse observations, and even verify Einstein's theory of general relativity by observing starlight bending around the sun during totality, we begin to appreciate how this coincidence has become instrumental to our understanding of the cosmos itself, transforming a moment of celestial alignment into a gateway for scientific discovery. The next total solar eclipse visible from Earth will occur in 2026, and astronomers continue to use these rare events to probe the mysteries of solar physics, from the heating mechanisms of the corona to the behavior of charged particles in the solar wind, reminding us that this celestial geometry, however temporary in cosmic timescales, remains one of nature's most generous gifts to scientific inquiry. Yet as the moon continues its inexorable retreat into space, we are living through a brief window of cosmic history where this perfect alignment remains possible, a fleeting epoch that reminds us that the universe's most meaningful gifts are often temporary, and that our generation's ability to witness totality is not a guarantee for those who will inherit the Earth millions of years hence. Consider the spiral arrangement of seeds in a sunflower head, where thousands of tiny seeds pack themselves into a mesmerizing pattern that seems almost too perfect to be natural, yet there it is in every meadow and garden across the world. Observe the unfurling fronds of a fern as they emerge from the center, each new leaf positioned at a precise angle relative to its predecessor, creating a logarithmic spiral that appears deliberately engineered by some unseen architect. Look at the spiral of a nautilus shell, the swirling arrangement of pine cone scales, the helical twist of climbing vines, the branching patterns of trees and rivers, and the spiral arms of distant galaxies themselves, and you will find that these natural formations seem to follow the Fibonacci sequence, that mathematical progression where each number is the sum of the two preceding ones. The human mind encounters this pattern so frequently in nature that it registers as profound, almost supernatural, yet the explanation lies not in cosmic design, but in the simple physics of growth and optimization. When a plant grows, each new seed or leaf must position itself to maximize exposure to sunlight and minimize competition with its siblings, and the angle that achieves this most efficiently turns out to be approximately 137.5 degrees, known as the golden angle. This angle emerges directly from the golden ratio, which emerges directly from the Fibonacci sequence, which emerges directly from the basic mathematics of recursive growth. The coincidence that this mathematical relationship appears everywhere in nature is not actually a coincidence at all, but rather the inevitable result of evolution favoring efficient growth patterns, and natural selection has spent millions of years perfecting these arrangements. Yet despite understanding this mechanism completely, despite knowing the mathematics and the biology that explains it, we continue to find these spirals beautiful and somehow meaningful, treating them as if they hold secrets or represent some deeper universal principle. The pattern persists in our consciousness as remarkable not because it defies explanation, but because explanation has failed to diminish its wonder. Perhaps this is the truest mark of nature's elegance, that knowing how a thing works need not rob it of its power to move us, and the sunflower's spiral remains no less magnificent for being the product of mathematical necessity rather than divine intention. We might even say that this is where science and wonder converge most perfectly, in recognizing that the sunflower does not need a reason beyond itself to justify our awe, and that understanding the golden ratio makes us not less enchanted by nature, but rather more intimate with its deepest logic. When we trace the spiral of a hurricane or observe the arrangement of leaves on a stem, we are witnessing the same mathematical poetry that governs the unfurling of galaxies, a reminder that the universe operates according to principles so fundamental and elegant that they transcend the boundaries between the microscopic and the cosmic, between the living and the inanimate. In this way, the Fibonacci spiral becomes not merely a pattern to observe, but a lens through which to understand how nature solves problems. How a sunflower's seed head and a galaxy's rotating arms both arrive at the same mathematical solution through entirely different processes, suggesting that efficiency and beauty are not separate virtues, but are perhaps two names for the same fundamental truth. And perhaps this is why the Fibonacci spiral captivates us across cultures and centuries, because in tracing its mathematics, we are ultimately tracing the logic of our own existence, recognizing ourselves as products. Have you ever noticed that certain proportions appear consistently throughout nature, art, and architecture, creating a sense of aesthetic harmony that feels almost deliberately designed, yet occurs spontaneously across vastly different contexts and cultures that could never have communicated with one another? And this phenomenon, known as the golden ratio or phi, manifesting as approximately 1.618 to 1, seems to emerge in the spiraling shells of nautiluses. The arrangement of seeds in sunflowers, the proportions of the human face and body, the dimensions of classical Greek temples, the compositions of Renaissance paintings, and even the structure of galaxies themselves, leading many people to conclude that this mathematical constant represents some fundamental organizing principle woven into the fabric of existence itself, suggesting either divine intentionality or a deep physical law governing all creation. The psychological mechanism driving our perception of this phenomenon involves a combination of pattern recognition, confirmation bias, and the human brain's natural tendency to find meaning in mathematical relationships. Because when we learn about the golden ratio, we become primed to notice it everywhere we look, and our visual cortex suddenly highlights instances where proportions seem to approximate this ratio, while simultaneously filtering out the countless examples that deviate from it, creating a cognitive illusion of ubiquity where in reality the golden ratio appears far less frequently and consistently than popular culture suggests. Yet the ratio does genuinely emerge in certain biological contexts due to optimization principles where growth patterns that follow logarithmic spirals happen to produce proportions near phi because these patterns are efficient for survival and resource gathering. What makes this coincidence particularly persistent despite its partial basis in selective perception is that the golden ratio has been elevated to almost mythological status in contemporary discourse, becoming embedded in design principles, marketing materials, and wellness culture, where it functions as a kind of modern aesthetic religion offering reassurance that beauty and order are mathematically explicable and universally recognizable. And we have collectively normalized the exaggeration and misrepresentation of its prevalence by treating it as a hidden code, rather than acknowledging that while phi does appear meaningfully in certain contexts, our tendency to retroactively identify it in photographs, faces, and artworks through selective measurement and generous rounding has transformed it from an interesting mathematical observation into a kind of benign numerological obsession that persists precisely because it feels profound, and because accepting that much of what we perceive as cosmic order is actually our pattern-seeking minds creating meaning from ambiguous data is somehow less emotionally satisfying than believing in a universal principle of harmony. Yet perhaps this is itself worth understanding. The golden ratio persists in our collective imagination not because it is universally present, but because we have a deep psychological need to believe that beauty and order follow discoverable rules, and in searching for phi everywhere, we are really searching for evidence that the universe is fundamentally intelligible and that our aesthetic preferences are not arbitrary but rooted in something objectively real and eternal. This hunger for cosmic coherence reveals something fundamental about human consciousness itself. We are meaning-making creatures who cannot help but search for the numerical skeleton beneath the skin of experience, and perhaps that impulse, regardless of whether the golden ratio truly dissect. The mathematical constant pi, that endless string of digits beginning with 3.1415926535589, appears with such startling frequency in places where we would never expect to find it that it seems almost as though the universe itself is playing an elaborate joke on our sense of mathematical order. Consider the phenomenon of pi appearing in probability distributions that have nothing to do with circles, in the behavior of pendulums swinging back and forth through the air, in the distribution of prime numbers across the vast landscape of integers, or even in the way that a river meanders across a floodplain, where the ratio of the actual winding length of the river to the straight-line distance it travels tends toward pi over many generations of geological time. These appearances seem impossible at first, almost supernatural in their coincidental nature, because we learned that pi was fundamentally about circles, about the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, and yet here it is, lurking in equations and phenomena that contain no circles whatsoever. The explanation lies in something far more profound than mere coincidence, rooted in the deep mathematical structures that underlie reality itself, where pi emerges not as a quirk of circles, but as an inevitable consequence of symmetry, optimization, and the fundamental ways that calculus and higher mathematics describe the behavior of waves, rotations, and periodic phenomena that exist throughout nature. When systems reach equilibrium, or when they oscillate, or when they distribute themselves randomly across space, the mathematics that governs them almost inevitably calls upon the transcendental properties that pi represents, making it less of a surprise and more of an unavoidable truth woven into the fabric of mathematical reality. Yet despite understanding this explanation intellectually, the visceral sense of astonishment persists whenever we encounter pi in some unexpected corner of physics or biology or economics, and we have come to accept that this strange constant will forever appear in places it seemingly has no right to be, a mathematical ghost that haunts every corner of our universe, reminding us that beauty and order run far deeper than our initial intuitions can fathom. Perhaps the most humbling aspect of pi's ubiquity is that each new discovery of its appearance forces us to reconsider what we thought we understood about mathematics itself, suggesting that there may be even deeper connections waiting to be uncovered in domains we have not yet fully explored. And indeed, recent discoveries in fields ranging from quantum mechanics to the geometry of protein folding suggest that pi's reach extends even further than mathematicians had imagined, hinting that what we perceive as coincidence may be evidence of a profound mathematical unity underlying all of existence, where pi serves not merely as a constant, but as a fundamental signature of how the universe organizes itself. In this sense, pi becomes not merely a number to be calculated, but a window into the hidden architecture of reality, a mathematical key that unlocks understanding across disciplines as seemingly disparate as fluid dynamics, neuroscience, and cosmology, each revealing new layers of how this ancient constant continues to surprise us. The journey of understanding pi's omnipresence transforms from mere mathematical curiosity into a philosophical meditation on the nature of knowledge itself, where each new discovery reminds us that the universe speaks in a language far more elegant and interconnected than our fragmented disciplines suggest, and that perhaps pi is not a constant we have discovered, but rather a fundamental truth we are gradually learning to recognize. Imagine yourself in a room with just 23 other people, a seemingly modest gathering of colleagues, classmates, or strangers brought together by circumstance. As you stand among them, engaged in ordinary conversation, there exists a probability lurking beneath the surface that seems almost impossible to believe, and yet it is mathematically certain. There is a greater than 50% chance that two people in that room share the exact same birthday, the same month and day of their birth, regardless of the year they were born. This phenomenon, known as the birthday paradox, defies our intuitive understanding of probability and statistics in such a profound way that when people first encounter it, they typically refuse to accept the mathematics as true. The human mind, when calculating such odds, tends to approach the problem by thinking about the likelihood of someone else sharing their specific birthday, which is comparatively rare, occurring only once in roughly 365 chances. However, the actual calculation involves considering all possible pairings within the group rather than individual comparisons to a single reference point. With 23 people in a room, the number of unique pairs that can be formed is 253, and each of those pairs has its own independent probability of matching birthdays. As you multiply these overlapping possibilities together, accounting for each potential pairing, the combined probability rapidly climbs towards certainty in a way that our brains simply did not evolve to process intuitively. This disconnect between mathematical reality and human intuition creates a cognitive illusion of sorts, where our pattern recognition systems, honed through millennia of evolution to spot meaningful coincidences in our immediate environment, catastrophically underestimate the likelihood of such matches occurring through pure chance. We are fundamentally biased towards sequential, linear thinking about probability, imagining ourselves as the center point against which all other probabilities must be measured, rather than understanding the exponential explosion of possibilities that emerges from group interactions. And despite the birthday paradox being well documented in mathematical literature for decades, despite it being taught in introductory statistics courses worldwide. People continue to experience genuine shock and disbelief when they observe it manifest in real social situations. A room full of people experiences what feels like an astonishing, almost mystical coincidence when two individuals discover their shared birthday, and the revelation carries an emotional weight that defies the mathematical explanation. We have become so normalized to the idea that coincidences feel profound and meaningful that even when presented with the logical framework explaining why such coincidences must occur, we still perceive them through a lens of wonderment, as if the mathematics somehow diminishes neither the surprise nor the strange beauty of the moment itself. Perhaps this is the true paradox beneath the numerical one, that understanding the mechanism of coincidence does nothing to diminish its psychological impact, and in fact, knowing the mathematics might only deepen our appreciation for how thoroughly our minds are shaped by intuition rather than reason, and how even armed with complete knowledge of probability, we remain creatures who feel wonder at the patterns we encounter in the world around us. The birthday paradox thus becomes a mirror reflecting the very nature of human consciousness itself. We are storytellers who cannot help but weave narratives of meaning around the statistical inevitabilities that surround us, transforming pure mathematics into moments. In 1913, Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung was conducting a session with a female patient who had been describing her dreams, particularly one involving a golden scarab beetle, a symbol from ancient Egyptian mythology that held deep archetypal significance in her unconscious mind. As she spoke about this dream scarab with Jung listening intently, both of them suddenly heard a soft tapping sound against the window of his consulting room in Zurich. Jung rose from his seat and opened the window to discover a living scarab beetle, or more precisely, a rose chafer beetle, which was the closest European equivalent, attempting to enter the room from outside. He collected the insect and presented it to his astonished patient, suggesting that perhaps her unconscious mind had somehow reached out into the physical world to validate itself. Jung interpreted this moment as a profound example of what he called synchronicity, a principle suggesting that meaningful coincidences occur when internal psychological states align with external events in ways that transcend simple causality. The mechanism behind such experiences typically involves pattern recognition and selective attention, processes where our minds unconsciously search for confirmation of our current thoughts and expectations, filtering out the countless ordinary moments that would contradict our narrative. When a patient is thinking intensely about scarab beetles and a beetle appears at precisely that moment, the convergence feels impossibly meaningful because our brains are primed to notice connections rather than dismiss them as random chance. What makes Jung's scarab moment particularly persistent in popular culture and psychological discourse is how it satisfied a deep human need to believe that consciousness itself might influence reality, that our inner worlds are somehow mysteriously connected to outer events through mechanisms we do not yet understand. Despite decades of scientific scrutiny, finding no evidence for actual psychokinetic effects or meaningful non-random clustering of such coincidences, the story endures because it captures something emotionally resonant about human experience, the feeling that sometimes the universe seems to listen and respond to our deepest preoccupations, even when probability and rational analysis suggest we're simply noticing what we were already primed to see. Yet this very human susceptibility to meaningful pattern making may itself be the most important insight Jung's scarab moment offers us. Not that consciousness bends reality to its will, but that our minds are fundamentally storytelling machines, constantly weaving threads of significance through the random tapestry of events, and that understanding this tendency is essential to distinguishing between genuine insight and the comforting illusions we create to make sense of an indifferent universe. This recognition does not diminish Jung's contributions to psychology, but rather repositions his true genius, not in documenting the supernatural, but in understanding how profoundly our narratives shape our reality, and how the stories we tell ourselves about coincidence, meaning, and connection are themselves the most revealing windows into the human psyche. The irony is that Jung himself understood this. His later work on synchronicity was less about claiming magical connections and more about exploring how meaning-making is itself a fundamental human need that deserves serious psychological attention, suggesting that the real miracle lies not in beetles appearing on cue, but in our capacity to transform random events into narratives that help us navigate an uncertain world. Wolfgang Pauli was an Austrian theoretical physicist whose name became attached to one of the most peculiar and enduring superstitions in the scientific community, a phenomenon that persists to this day despite our modern understanding of probability and mechanics. The Pauli effect refers to the alleged tendency for experimental apparatus to malfunction or break down whenever Pauli was present in the laboratory, a curse so notorious that his colleagues developed an elaborate mythology around his mere proximity to delicate instruments and sensitive equipment. Countless anecdotes circulated through universities and research institutions describing how expensive particle detectors would fail, how precisely calibrated machines would suddenly develop inexplicable glitches, and how equipment that functioned perfectly would inexplicably cease operating the moment Pauli entered the room, only to resume normal operation after his departure. The effect became so well known that Pauli himself embraced the legend with characteristic humor and wit, acknowledging the strange pattern while maintaining his scientific skepticism about its underlying cause. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is that it emerged from the intersection of genuine coincidence, selective memory, and the very human tendency to impose narrative patterns onto random events, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where each broken instrument added another layer to the legend. The psychological mechanism behind the Pauli effect operates through several interconnected cognitive biases that all of us experience naturally in our daily lives. When a famous or remarkable person is associated with a location or situation, observers unconsciously begin to selectively remember instances that confirm the narrative while forgetting or dismissing instances that contradict it, a process known as confirmation bias. Equipment failures occur in every laboratory with regular and predictable frequency, representing nothing more than the natural entropy of complex mechanical and electronic systems. Yet when such failures happened to coincide with Pauli's visits, they became part of the legend, while the numerous times he visited without incident faded into forgotten routine. The human brain is exquisitely adapted to detect patterns and construct meaningful narratives from seemingly chaotic data, and this strength becomes a weakness when we encounter genuinely random distributions that our pattern recognition systems interpret as significant. Additionally, there existed a social component wherein younger scientists and colleagues perhaps unconsciously performed less carefully or with divided attention when such a famous and intimidating figure was present, potentially increasing genuine error rates that could be attributed to the curse. The emotional and social context of Pauli's presence in a laboratory may have created subtle shifts in how people interacted with equipment and technology, introducing human error factors that were then attributed to something mystical rather than mundane. What remains most remarkable about the Pauli effect is how thoroughly it persists in scientific circles even today, decades after Pauli's death, maintained through oral tradition and repeated references in textbooks and popular science literature despite having absolutely no basis in any measurable physical principle. We have normalized the retelling of this legend as a charming historical anecdote, while somehow overlooking that we are perpetuating a superstition within the allegedly rational scientific community, a reminder that even highly educated individuals remain subject to the same cognitive limitations and narrative biases that drive superstitions throughout human cultures. Roy Sullivan was a park ranger working in the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia during the middle decades of the 20th century, and over the course of his lifetime, he experienced something so statistically improbable that it has become one of the most frequently cited examples of extraordinary coincidence in modern times. Between the years of 1934 and 1977, Sullivan was struck by lightning on 7 separate occasions, surviving every single strike with varying degrees of injury and recovery, making him one of the most lightning-struck individuals in recorded history. The first strike occurred in 1935 when he was working as a ranger, and the subsequent strikes continued throughout his life at intervals that seemed to defy all reasonable probability, with each incident documented and verified by authorities and medical professionals who treated his injuries. The odds of being struck by lightning even once in a lifetime are approximately 1 in 500,000, and yet Sullivan experienced this phenomenon multiple times, leading many people to wonder whether there was something fundamentally unusual about his circumstances, his location, his profession, or perhaps even his own biological makeup. What makes this case particularly fascinating is not merely the frequency of the strikes themselves, but rather the way that our human minds struggle to comprehend events that fall so far outside the realm of normal statistical expectation that they seem to challenge our understanding of how probability actually functions in the real world. Scientists and statisticians have pointed out that while Sullivan's case is extraordinarily rare, it is not actually impossible, and that with millions of people living through decades of exposure to outdoor environments, some individuals will inevitably experience unlikely clustering of rare events simply by the laws of large numbers and the way that probability distributes itself across populations over time. The case of Roy Sullivan has become almost mythological in its retelling, appearing in countless lists of incredible coincidences and defying explanation. Yet when examined through the lens of mathematical probability and the sheer scope of human experience across generations, it becomes clear that such extreme outliers must occasionally exist, and that the very improbability that makes his story so compelling is precisely what we should expect to happen sometimes. Even if it happens only rarely and only to a small number of individuals across all of human history. Sullivan's case ultimately serves as a humbling reminder that human intuition about probability is deeply flawed, and that we tend to see patterns and significance in random events precisely because our brains are wired to seek meaning and narrative coherence in the world around us, even when none truly exists. Yet Sullivan himself seemed largely unbothered by his peculiar fate, continuing his work as a ranger for decades and treating each strike as merely another occupational hazard, a perspective that perhaps reveals more about human resilience and adaptation than it does about the lightning itself. In the end, Sullivan's story transcends mere statistical curiosity to become a meditation on how we confront the inexplicable forces of nature that surround us, and how some individuals possess an almost stoic acceptance of circumstances entirely beyond their control, finding meaning not in the rarity of their experience, but in the simple fact of their survival and perseverance through it. Sullivan's story reminds us that extraordinary lives are often lived by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with quiet dignity. Among the most astonishing coincidences that seem to defy the laws of probability, we find the remarkable cases of individuals who have won significant lottery jackpots not once, but twice in their lifetimes, and in some instances, even 3 or more times. One of the most famous examples involves a woman from South Carolina who won the state lottery twice within a span of just 3 years, collecting prizes that totaled millions of dollars, an occurrence so statistically improbable that it seems almost designed by fate itself to challenge our understanding of random chance. Another case involves a man from Pennsylvania who matched 5 out of 6 numbers in his state lottery twice, winning substantial sums each time, leading him to become something of a local celebrity whose story spread throughout his community like wildfire. When we examine these cases more closely, the psychological mechanism at work reveals itself through a phenomenon known as the availability heuristic, wherein people who have already won lotteries tend to play more frequently and with greater enthusiasm than the general population, thereby increasing their actual odds through sheer repetition and persistence rather than through any supernatural intervention. Furthermore, lottery winners often develop stronger beliefs in their own luck and intuition after their first victory, causing them to play with more confidence and conviction, selecting numbers that feel significant to them personally and entering more drawings throughout the year, which mathematically increases their chances of winning again despite the odds remaining theoretically the same for each individual draw. The story of these repeat winners persists in our collective consciousness and continues to circulate through media outlets and social conversations, because it perfectly encapsulates humanity's eternal struggle with the concepts of luck, destiny, and the role of chance in shaping our lives. And even though we understand intellectually that winning twice requires no less improbability than winning once, we find ourselves emotionally compelled by the narrative, treating it as evidence that some people are simply chosen by fortune, while overlooking the thousands of other frequent players whose dedication to lottery games never results in a single prize, their lost tickets and empty wallets forming an invisible backdrop to the celebrated few whose names become immortalized in the annals of improbable victories. Yet this selective memory, this tendency to remember the exceptional while forgetting the ordinary, reveals more about human nature than it does about probability itself. We construct narratives of destiny from the raw material of chance, transforming mathematical outliers into heroes of fate, because our minds are simply better at remembering stories than statistics. In this way, the twice-blessed lottery winner becomes a modern myth, a narrative vehicle through which we explore our deepest desires for control over an inherently uncontrollable universe, even as the actual mechanics of their fortune remain stubbornly, reassuringly random. A reminder that sometimes the most profound truths about human nature emerge not from the winners themselves, but from our collective fascination with their improbable stories. Indeed, this fascination explains why we eagerly share these stories across generations, while simultaneously ignoring the statistical reality that lottery participation itself represents a form of voluntary taxation on those with the least financial resources, demonstrating how our narrative-driven minds can simultaneously understand probability intellectually while remaining emotionally invested in the myths we construct around its exceptions. On December 17, 1971, a commercial airliner carrying 92 passengers and crew departed Lima, Peru, bound for the city of Pucallpa, flying directly into what would become one of history's most improbable survival stories, a narrative so statistically unlikely that it challenges our fundamental understanding of chance and human resilience. 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke, a German-Peruvian girl traveling with her mother Maria, sat in seat 19A as the plane ascended into the afternoon sky, unaware that within the hour, her entire existence would be fundamentally altered by a collision with an unseen force. During the flight, a severe thunderstorm developed in their path, and the aircraft, a Lockheed Electra, encountered what pilots would later describe as extraordinary weather conditions, with lightning striking the plane's right wing during a particularly violent electrical discharge that tore the wing structure apart catastrophically. The aircraft disintegrated at 10,000 feet, fragmenting into wreckage that scattered across the dense Peruvian rainforest, and in this moment of absolute devastation, Juliane found herself in free fall, still strapped to her seat, tumbling through the air at tremendous velocity toward the canopy below. She lost consciousness during the descent and awoke hours later, suspended in a seat harness above the jungle floor, her body pierced by a fractured collarbone, a deep gash on her right arm, and numerous cuts and bruises, yet miraculously alive despite forces that should have rendered survival mathematically impossible. What makes her survival statistically extraordinary is not merely that she lived through the crash itself, but that she managed to survive alone in one of Earth's most hostile environments, the Peruvian Amazon rainforest, for 11 days with minimal supplies and no established rescue plan, navigating through dense jungle populated by jaguars, anacondas, and indigenous tribes, drinking from streams and eating insects and small animals she could find. The psychological mechanism underlying her survival appears rooted in a combination of practical resourcefulness, youthful adaptability, and a systematic determination to move toward civilization rather than remain at the crash site, suggesting that humans possess remarkable cognitive reserves that activate under extreme duress, allowing problem-solving abilities to override the panic response that typically accompanies such trauma. Her eventual rescue occurred when she stumbled upon a small camp of loggers who, recognizing her desperate condition, provided assistance and arranged her evacuation to medical care in the nearest town, restoring her to the wider world with a narrative so profoundly improbable that it has become a touchstone for discussions of survivorship and the inexplicable nature of chance itself. What persists about this story, despite its obvious impossibility, is our collective need to believe that human determination, combined with luck and circumstance, can overcome scenarios designed by probability to result in fatality, and we continue to return to Juliane's account as a form of psychological reassurance, suggesting that the universe occasionally grants exceptions to its own cruel statistical rules. Even when we possess no logical framework for understanding why such exceptions should ever occur. Her story has since inspired countless survival memoirs and documentaries, each attempting to extract actionable wisdom from her experience, yet the fundamental truth remains that no amount of preparation or positive thinking can reliably predict who will survive and who will perish when confronted with genuine catastrophe, leaving us to accept that Juliane's survival ultimately rests upon. On May 6, 1937, the German passenger airship Hindenburg caught fire and was destroyed while attempting to dock at Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey, killing 35 of the 97 people on board, in what remains one of the most catastrophic aviation disasters in history. Among the journalists and photographers present that day was Captain Sam Shear, a photographer working for the Hearst newspaper syndicate. And what makes his presence at this tragedy particularly extraordinary is that Shear had documented another major disaster just weeks earlier when he photographed a tugboat explosion in New York Harbor, placing him at the scene of two separate catastrophic events within a remarkably short span of time. However, what deepens this coincidence into something that feels almost impossible is that Shear's photograph of the Hindenburg disaster became the single most iconic image of the event, the most reproduced and recognized photograph capturing the moment of destruction, ensuring that his face and name became forever linked to one of history's greatest tragedies despite being merely present by chance rather than by assignment. The human mind processes such clustering of unlikely events through a phenomenon called apophenia, where we naturally recognize patterns in random data and attach significance to coincidences that occur within compressed timeframes. And when we add the element of historical importance and the amplification of a single powerful image across decades of media reproduction, the coincidence becomes magnified in our collective memory far beyond what the raw probabilities might suggest. We tend to forget that there were numerous other photographers present that day, that tugboat explosions and maritime disasters were not uncommon occurrences in 1937, and that the assignment of photographers to major news events meant that certain individuals would naturally be positioned at multiple significant moments throughout their careers. Yet the specificity of Shear's role in creating the most famous image makes us feel as though invisible hands were orchestrating his movements, when in reality he was simply doing his job as a working journalist in an era before television made such scenes instantly accessible to the masses. And his presence at these moments has become legend primarily because of how we have chosen to remember and redistribute these historical narratives, rather than because of anything truly supernatural or impossibly improbable occurring in the actual sequence of events. The same pattern repeats throughout history. We remember the reporter who happened to be in Dealey Plaza when Kennedy was shot, or the photographer positioned at the fall of the Berlin Wall, not because their presence was orchestrated by fate, but because their images became the visual definition of those moments for subsequent generations, transforming coincidence into inevitability through the selective lens of collective memory. The tragedy of apophenia is that it convinces us our memories are windows into cosmic design when they are actually mirrors reflecting our own tendency to organize chaos into meaningful narratives, a tendency so powerful that it can transform a photographer's ordinary presence at extraordinary events into a story we retell as proof that some lives are touched by destiny rather than probability. And perhaps this is why we find Sam Shear's story so compelling. It offers us permission to believe that our own presence at significant moments or our own clustering of unlikely coincidences might mean something beyond chance, that the universe is paying attention to our small lives in ways we cannot yet perceive. Consider the peculiar phenomenon wherein people frequently discover that their eventual romantic partners grew up in circumstances that mirror their own childhood environments in unexpected and often uncanny ways, a discovery that typically occurs only after they have already committed to a long-term relationship or marriage. Individuals often find themselves astonished to learn that their spouse grew up in the same geographic region, attended similar educational institutions, shared comparable family structures, or even encountered the same formative experiences during their developmental years, despite having met through what seemed like entirely random circumstances. A person raised in a particular town might discover their future husband grew up just 2 neighborhoods over, or someone from a specific cultural background might partner with someone who shares an identical heritage, and they will often describe these revelations with a sense of fatalistic wonder, as though some invisible force had been quietly orchestrating their connection all along. The mechanism underlying this apparent coincidence is rooted in what psychologists call assortative mating, a well-documented phenomenon wherein individuals unconsciously gravitate toward partners with similar backgrounds, education levels, socioeconomic statuses, and life experiences. Our brains are equipped with sophisticated pattern recognition systems that make us more attracted to people whose backgrounds feel familiar and comprehensible, whose family dynamics we can understand without extensive explanation, whose cultural references we intuitively grasp, and whose formative experiences create an immediate sense of mutual understanding. We tend to frequent environments and social circles that naturally filter for people similar to ourselves, whether through educational institutions, professional networks, religious communities, or geographic proximity, which mathematically increases the likelihood that our romantic partners will share our background characteristics. Yet despite the logical clarity of this explanation, we continue to experience genuine astonishment when these parallels reveal themselves, treating the discovery as a sign of cosmic alignment rather than the predictable outcome of homophilic social dynamics and our brain's preference for the recognizable over the strange. Perhaps this tendency explains why we construct narratives of destiny around what are ultimately products of our own selective perception and social positioning. We find meaning in the mirror because mirrors are precisely what we have sought out, whether consciously or not, and the comfort of recognition masquerades as fate. In this light, the shock of discovering that your spouse's mother also worked as a nurse, or that they too grew up in a house with a creek running behind it, becomes less a whisper from the universe and more a testament to how thoroughly we have already filtered our social world before ever meeting them. The uncanny similarity is not the exception that proves some deeper magic at work. It is the inevitable result of having constructed our lives in ways that were always destined to intersect with someone remarkably like ourselves. And so we mistake the architecture of our own choices for the hand of fate, finding profound meaning in what amounts to a statistical inevitability dressed up in the language of romance. We are, in the end, not so much fated to meet our partners as we are engineered by circumstance to seek them out from the very beginning. This realization need not diminish the genuine intimacy of such connections. Rather, it suggests that love often flourishes precisely because we have unconsciously chosen partners whose life stories we are already equipped to understand and. In the summer of 2013, a woman named Sarah experienced what seemed like an impossible series of events that would challenge her understanding of probability and fate. She had lost her grandmother's wedding ring while swimming in a lake near her hometown, a devastating loss that she mourned for several weeks as the ring lay somewhere in the murky depths, seemingly irretrievable forever. 6 months later, while preparing a freshly caught fish for dinner that her husband had purchased from a local fishmonger, Sarah discovered something glinting inside the fish's stomach, something that made her hands tremble with disbelief. There, nestled among the fish's digestive contents, was her grandmother's ring, perfectly intact and still bearing the same distinctive scratches she remembered from her childhood. The fishmonger confirmed that the fish had been caught from the very same lake where she had lost the ring, a body of water connected to dozens of other waterways where fish routinely migrate and feed. The odds of a specific fish, among thousands, consuming a specific ring, surviving with it intact, being caught by a particular person, and then being sold to the exact person who lost it seemed astronomically impossible, yet it had occurred. What makes this scenario psychologically compelling is how it invokes our deep human need to find meaning and design in random events, a cognitive bias known as patternicity, whereby our brains are wired to detect patterns even when none exist or when patterns emerge purely through chance. We are evolutionarily predisposed to recognize meaningful connections because ancestors who detected patterns, whether real or illusory, survived better than those who ignored potential threats or opportunities. The fish story captures this perfectly because it presents a chain of independent, unrelated events that nonetheless converge into a narrative that feels authored by some invisible intelligence, when in reality each component can be explained through ordinary biological and commercial processes. Fish consume objects in their environment constantly, people lose jewelry and water regularly, fishermen catch thousands of fish daily, and retail distribution networks move products across vast distances perpetually. The intersection of all these mundane activities is bound to produce strange convergences occasionally, yet when they happen to us personally, when they involve something emotionally significant like a lost heirloom, our minds insist on interpreting the event as a message, a sign, or proof of cosmic intervention rather than simple statistical inevitability. Despite understanding the mechanical explanations for how the ring traveled through a fish's digestive system and eventually reached Sarah's dinner table, we remain enchanted by stories like these, and we continue to seek them out and share them, suggesting that our rational understanding of probability and coincidence cannot fully suppress our innate inclination to experience wonder at the intersection of chance and personal meaning. The story persists in our cultural consciousness not because it defies explanation, but because it represents something we desperately want to believe about the universe, namely that coincidence itself might be a language through which fate communicates with us. Perhaps this is why we collect such stories like talismans, treasuring them as evidence that the universe occasionally bends toward our desires, and why Sarah herself likely retold this account countless times, each retelling a small ritual of reassurance that randomness and intention are not as separate as science suggests they should be. Consider the documented case of the Jim twins, separated at birth and raised in different states by different families, who upon reuniting discovered they had both named their sons James Jr., both worked as volunteer firefighters, both married women named Linda, divorced those women, and then married women named Betty, both owned dogs named Toy, and both experienced similar patterns of headaches and health issues throughout their lives. A convergence so improbable that it seems to violate our basic understanding of how environment shapes identity and behavior. This case, along with numerous other documented instances of separated twins following eerily similar life trajectories, presents us with a fascinating psychological puzzle that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of personality, destiny, and the degree to which our choices are truly our own, or simply the inevitable unfolding of genetic predisposition. The mechanism behind these parallels likely involves a combination of factors that we tend to underestimate in our modern understanding of human development, beginning with the profound influence of inherited temperament and personality traits that emerge from our genetic code and shape how we interpret the world, make decisions, and respond to opportunities before us. When two individuals inherit essentially identical genetic blueprints, they inherit not just physical characteristics, but also predispositions towards certain personality types, risk tolerances, and cognitive patterns that guide them towards similar choices and similar interpretations of similar situations, meaning that when they face a decision point about careers or relationships, their genetic inheritance subtly weights the scales in comparable directions. Beyond genetics, there exists the curious phenomenon of what we might call statistical inevitability, where if you consider the millions of possible life choices and experiences available to a person, and then consider two people making those choices somewhat independently, but from a similar genetic foundation, occasional convergence becomes not miraculous, but actually quite predictable from a probabilistic standpoint. Yet what strikes us most profoundly about these parallel twin lives is not the individual coincidences themselves, but rather our profound need to find meaning in them, our tendency to emphasize the similarities while quietly dismissing the countless differences, our selective memory that focuses on the matching names and careers while forgetting about the different homes, different schools, different friends, and different daily experiences that would have pulled these twins in radically different directions had we bothered to look. We have constructed a cultural narrative around separated twins that has become so normalized in our consciousness that we rarely stop to consider how our own confirmation bias shapes our perception of their lives, how we unconsciously notice and remember the parallels while letting the divergences fade into the background, creating an artificial sense of cosmic connection that feels true precisely because we have trained ourselves to see it that way. Consider how a researcher studying separated twins will naturally collect more detailed information about similarities than differences, how media coverage emphasizes the amazing coincidences rather than the mundane divergences, and how the twins themselves, once aware of each other's lives, may unconsciously begin to mirror choices they learn about, creating a feedback loop where initial coincidence gradually becomes reinforced performance. Throughout history, we encounter a peculiar phenomenon where multiple inventors working independently in different parts of the world arrive at nearly identical technological breakthroughs within months or even weeks of each other, creating an uncanny sense of inevitability that seems to defy statistical probability. The telephone was developed simultaneously by Alexander Graham Bell and Antonio Meucci. Calculus was independently discovered by both Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz, and the theory of evolution by natural selection emerged in the minds of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace at virtually the same moment in time, each working without knowledge of the other's progress. Photography experienced this phenomenon as well, with multiple inventors creating functional photographic processes in the 1830s, while the airplane saw the Wright brothers achieve powered flight mere years before numerous other experimenters around the globe were approaching identical solutions through their own investigations and mechanical innovations. The explanation for this phenomenon lies not in cosmic synchronicity or mysterious forces, but rather in what historians and philosophers call the convergence of technological readiness and intellectual prerequisites. When certain scientific discoveries reach a critical threshold of understanding, when the foundational knowledge becomes widespread enough among educated minds, and when the practical need for a solution becomes urgent enough to motivate independent research, multiple brilliant individuals will naturally arrive at similar conclusions because they are all drawing from the same reservoir of available knowledge and responding to the same environmental pressures. The telegraph had to be invented before telephone could logically follow, metallurgy had to advance before aviation could succeed, and mathematical frameworks had to mature before certain physical laws could be properly understood and articulated. We have perhaps normalized this pattern so thoroughly that it no longer surprises us when we learn of these simultaneous discoveries. Yet it remains a fascinating testament to how human progress moves not in isolated bursts of genius, but rather in predictable waves shaped by the underlying architecture of scientific progress itself. This understanding transforms how we view innovation itself, not as the product of rare individual brilliance striking like lightning, but as an inevitable unfolding of ideas whose time has simply come, where the question is never whether an invention will happen, but merely who among the many capable minds will receive the recognition for discovering what was already waiting to be found. This perspective also suggests that attempts to suppress or delay innovation through secrecy or monopoly face inherent limitations. If the conditions for invention are truly ripe, the knowledge will simply emerge elsewhere, making the race to discovery less about preventing competition and more about accepting that certain ideas are genuinely whose time has come, independent of any individual's desires or efforts to control their emergence. The history of the Internet itself provides perhaps the most compelling modern example of this principle. The foundational concepts of packet switching, hypertext, and distributed networks emerged from multiple research institutions simultaneously, each contributing essential pieces to what would become our global communications infrastructure. Suggesting that the digital revolution was not awaiting a single visionary, but was instead an inevitable consequence of accumulated computational theory finally reaching critical mass. Throughout history, we find ourselves repeatedly encountering dates and events that seem to echo across centuries in ways that feel almost deliberately arranged, as though time itself contains hidden patterns that mirror and repeat themselves with uncanny precision. Consider the striking phenomenon where major historical events have occurred on dates that contain repeated numbers or symmetrical patterns, or where significant anniversaries have aligned with new events of comparable magnitude in ways that seem far too coincidental to dismiss as mere chance. For instance, the observation that certain catastrophes or pivotal moments in human history have occurred on dates sharing numerical patterns with earlier disasters, or that major events have unfolded on the anniversaries of previous significant occurrences, creates a sense that history moves in cyclical rhythms rather than random progression. When we examine these patterns more carefully, we recognize that our minds are naturally drawn to recognize symmetry and repetition, because they stand out against the background noise of ordinary days that pass without fanfare or significance. Our brains have evolved to detect patterns as a survival mechanism, and when we encounter dates that mirror each other numerically or chronologically, we experience a cognitive resonance that makes these connections feel meaningful and intentional. The human memory system tends to reinforce these patterns once we become aware of them, causing us to remember the aligned dates while forgetting the countless other dates that do not align, creating a selection bias that makes historical mirrors seem far more common than statistical probability would suggest. We have collectively normalized this pattern recognition as part of how we narrativize history itself, structuring our understanding of the past around memorable markers and symmetrical moments, rather than recognizing that any sufficiently large dataset of dates will inevitably contain apparent repetitions and mirrors when examined with the intent to find them. The persistence of this phenomenon in our collective consciousness demonstrates how compelling our need is to find order and meaning within the chaos of historical events, even when that order exists primarily in the architecture of our own perception rather than in the actual unfolding of events themselves. This tendency reveals something profound about human consciousness itself. We are meaning-making creatures who instinctively weave narratives of connection and purpose through the raw material of temporal coincidence, transforming the indifferent passage of time into a story where nothing is truly random and everything carries symbolic weight. Yet this impulse to find historical mirrors may ultimately reveal less about time's structure and more about our deep psychological need to believe that the universe speaks in a language we can understand. That hidden behind the apparent randomness of events lies a comprehensible design waiting to be deciphered by those patient enough to search for it. In this light, the allure of historical date mirrors becomes not a window into cosmic order, but rather a mirror of the human soul, revealing our yearning to see ourselves as participants in a meaningful cosmos, rather than passive observers of arbitrary events unfolding across an indifferent timeline. Perhaps this explains why we find such comfort in documenting these mirrors. Each discovered pattern becomes a small reassurance that we are not merely swept along by time's current, but rather capable of reading the subtle language through which history speaks to those who know how to listen, even if that language is ultimately one we have taught ourselves to hear. Throughout American history, there exists a curious pattern of name coincidences among United States presidents that seems almost too strange to be mere chance, yet entirely explainable through the lens of linguistic probability and historical documentation. Consider the remarkable fact that two presidents separated by nearly 2 centuries both shared the surname Adams, yet were not directly related despite serving in the same office, while their family names appeared prominently in the founding generation of the nation itself. Additionally, there have been multiple presidents whose first names repeated across different administrations, creating an eerie symmetry when one casually reviews presidential lists and notices the recurring patterns of Williams, James, and Johns scattered throughout different centuries of leadership. The explanation for these coincidences lies fundamentally in the relatively limited pool of names that were popular during the periods when our presidents were born and named, particularly surnames rooted in Anglo-Saxon and Germanic traditions that dominated naming conventions in early America. When you consider that there have been only 46 presidencies and that American naming traditions have historically drawn from a relatively narrow cultural reservoir of approximately 300 to 400 common surnames, the mathematical probability of repetition becomes far less improbable than it initially appears. Furthermore, our brains are pattern recognition machines specifically evolved to identify connections and similarities, causing us to unconsciously weight these name coincidences with greater significance than we might assign to other random occurrences that do not trigger our cognitive pattern matching systems. We remember and emphasize the moments when presidential names align, while simultaneously ignoring the vast majority of instances when they do not, creating a psychological illusion of meaningful connection where none truly exists. Despite understanding the statistical and cognitive mechanisms that explain these coincidences, we continue to feel a subtle sense of wonder when encountering these name patterns, allowing the human capacity for storytelling and meaning-making to persist even in the face of rational explanation. This tension between rational understanding and emotional resonance mirrors our broader relationship with history itself. We know that coincidence is inevitable when examining large data sets, yet we cannot help but find narrative satisfaction in the echoes and parallels that emerge from the American presidency, transforming statistical inevitability into cultural meaning through the simple act of noticing and remembering. In this way, the Adams cousins, the multiple Jameses, and even the curious coincidence of Presidents Johnson separated by nearly a century become not merely statistical artifacts, but touchstones of national memory, small narrative threads that help us weave the sprawling tapestry of American leadership into a more comprehensible and emotionally resonant whole. Perhaps this is ultimately what we gain from noticing such coincidences, not factual insight, but a deeper appreciation for how human consciousness transforms the random data of history into meaningful story. And in recognizing this fundamental human need to find meaning in pattern, we come to understand that presidential name coincidences serve as a microcosm of how we construct historical narrative itself, transforming the indifferent chaos of events into a coherent story where each echo and recurrence feels like it must signify something profound about the arc of our national destiny. Have you ever noticed that certain modern celebrities bear a striking resemblance to historical figures, royalty, or ancestors from centuries past, to the point where the similarity becomes almost uncanny and difficult to explain through ordinary genetics alone? This phenomenon of celebrity doppelganger ancestors has become increasingly common in our digital age, where we can instantly compare photographs of contemporary movie stars, musicians, and public figures with paintings, photographs, and historical documents from generations long gone. The internet has amplified this observation to remarkable degrees, with countless social media posts, viral threads, and dedicated websites cataloging these astonishing likenesses between people separated by decades or even centuries, raising the natural question of whether we are witnessing genuine genetic inheritance patterns or whether something else entirely is at play in our perception of these coincidences. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves what researchers call pareidolia, combined with our brain's exceptional ability to recognize and remember human faces, a faculty so deeply ingrained in our evolution that we often find patterns and similarities even when they may not be as precise as we initially believe them to be. Our minds are extraordinarily attuned to facial features because survival once depended on quickly identifying family members, allies, and potential threats, which means that when we see a modern actor's cheekbones or jawline echo a historical portrait, our facial recognition systems light up with immediate recognition and familiarity, creating a sense of profound connection and cosmic significance. Additionally, the human face contains a limited number of configurations and proportions, which statistically ensures that across millions of people living across centuries, some individuals will inevitably share similar bone structure, eye spacing, nose shape, and other distinguishing characteristics. And when those individuals happen to be visually documented through media that makes them easy to compare, the coincidence becomes glaringly apparent to our perception. What makes this phenomenon particularly persistent in our contemporary culture is that we have normalized the comparison and celebration of these resemblances despite understanding intellectually that facial features are inherited traits that will naturally repeat across the human population when examined across sufficient time and numbers of individuals. We share these discoveries enthusiastically, marveling at the apparent impossibility of such visual echoes across generations. Yet we rarely pause to consider that these matches are statistically inevitable outcomes of human genetic variation rather than genuinely mysterious coincidences deserving of deeper investigation or explanation. Yet the entertainment value persists because these comparisons offer us a comforting sense of continuity and connection to history, a feeling that famous faces are somehow cosmically significant rather than products of simple genetic recombination. And this narrative proves far more compelling to share and discuss than the more mundane truth that human features naturally cluster into recognizable patterns across time. Perhaps this is ultimately why we remain fascinated by these resemblances despite their statistical inevitability. They grant us permission to believe that history and celebrity are somehow woven together by threads of fate rather than chance, transforming the mundane reality of inherited traits into a more poetic narrative about the cyclical nature of human beauty and prominence across generations. Throughout human history, people have reported experiencing dreams that seem to predict future events with startling accuracy, moments where they dreamed about a specific scenario only to wake and find that exact situation unfolding in reality, or receiving a vivid premonition about someone they love only to learn that person had an accident or fell ill at precisely that moment, creating an inexplicable sense of connection across time and space that defies our understanding of how consciousness and causality actually work. These experiences feel profoundly meaningful to those who have them, so much so that they often reshape how people view the nature of reality itself, leading them to believe they possess some latent psychic ability or that their subconscious mind can somehow access information about the future before it happens. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves several overlapping cognitive processes that create the illusion of genuine precognition, even though no supernatural ability is actually occurring. First, there is the simple matter of statistical probability and the sheer volume of dreams we experience throughout our lives. The average person has multiple dreams every single night, which means across a lifetime we accumulate tens of thousands of dream experiences. So by pure chance alone, some of these dreams will inevitably align with real future events, and when they do, we remember them with crystalline clarity while forgetting all the countless dreams that bore no relationship to reality whatsoever. Second, there is confirmation bias and selective memory, wherein we unconsciously edit our recollections of dreams to make them seem more accurate in retrospect, remembering the general emotional tone or vague impressions as having been far more specific than they actually were when we first experienced them. Additionally, our brains are pattern recognition machines that are desperately seeking meaning and connection. So when a dream and a future event seem even tangentially related, we immediately construct a narrative linking them together, ignoring all the ways they differ and emphasizing the ways they align. Despite understanding these mechanisms intellectually, the phenomenon persists in human consciousness because the experience itself feels so real and so immediate that it overwhelms our rational knowledge of probability and psychology, and because there remains something deeply human about wanting to believe that our minds possess hidden depths and abilities beyond the mundane, that consciousness might operate according to principles we do not yet fully comprehend. That perhaps there are bridges between the dream world and waking reality that science has simply not yet managed to measure or explain. Yet perhaps the most compelling aspect of premonition dreams is not whether they reveal genuine precognition, but rather what they illuminate about human consciousness itself, our profound need for agency and foresight in an uncertain world, and the ways our minds construct meaning from the chaos of experience to create a sense of coherence and control. In this light, premonition dreams become less about predicting the future and more about how we retrospectively construct narratives that make our lives feel less random and more purposeful, transforming ordinary coincidences into meaningful omens that reassure us we are somehow prepared for what lies ahead, even when the preparation exists only in our minds. This narrative function may ultimately be more valuable than literal prediction would be. The dream that makes us feel prepared, even if only psychologically, might subtly influence our decisions and perceptions in ways that create a self-fulfilling prophecy, blurring the line between preco. The phenomenon of twin telepathy has captivated human imagination for centuries, presenting itself in countless anecdotal accounts where identical twins seem to share thoughts, finish each other's sentences, or experience simultaneous sensations despite being separated by great distances. One twin might suddenly feel an inexplicable urge to call their sibling only to discover they were just thinking about picking up the phone. Or both twins might arrive at a location wearing nearly identical outfits they selected independently thousands of miles apart, events that feel so synchronized they seem to defy conventional explanation. These moments accumulate in the minds of twin pairs and their families, creating a narrative of almost supernatural connection that becomes deeply embedded in their sense of shared identity and mutual bond. When we examine these occurrences through a psychological and neurobiological lens, however, the mystery begins to unravel into something far more mundane yet equally fascinating. Twins, particularly identical twins, share not only genetic material but also extensive shared history, similar developmental pathways, comparable personality traits, and often remarkably parallel thinking patterns formed through years of intimate interaction and observation of one another. They develop intuitive understanding of each other's behavioral patterns, preferences, and likely responses to situations, creating a form of sophisticated prediction that feels telepathic but actually represents deep familiarity and pattern recognition operating at a subconscious level. Additionally, confirmation bias plays an essential role in perpetuating twin telepathy narratives, as coincidental moments of synchronization are remembered and reinforced, while the thousands of times twins think differently, wear different clothes, or fail to call each other at the same moment are forgotten or dismissed as unremarkable. Human memory selectively preserves the extraordinary while filtering out the ordinary, meaning that the random instances when twins do happen to think alike become the stories retold and celebrated. The shared environment, genetic predisposition toward similar circadian rhythms, and tendency to follow parallel life schedules mean that many supposed telepathic moments are statistically probable rather than improbable. Yet we continue to frame these ordinary coincidences as evidence of extraordinary connection, transforming what is essentially sophisticated subconscious intuition and selective memory into something that feels almost mystical and undeniably special. Yet this reframing, from coincidence to connection, serves an important psychological function, reinforcing the unique bond twins share and giving meaning to their relationship in ways that purely scientific explanations cannot capture, suggesting that the magic of twin telepathy may lie not in supernatural phenomena, but in the remarkable power of intimacy, familiarity, and shared identity to create moments that feel genuinely transcendent. In this way, twin telepathy becomes less about defying the laws of nature and more about celebrating the extraordinary potential of human connection itself. A reminder that the most profound mysteries of consciousness may ultimately be found not in the unexplained, but in the depths of relationships we cultivate through years of shared existence and mutual understanding. Perhaps this is why twins themselves often resist the urge to scientifically debunk their experiences, because accepting the rational explanation would diminish something precious, a shared language of intuition and understanding that has become inseparable from their identity and offers a form of connection that transcends the need for empirical verification. Have you ever noticed that déjà vu does not arrive alone, but rather in waves, clustering around certain periods of your life, where you experience the uncanny sensation of reliving a moment multiple times within the span of days or weeks, only to have it vanish almost entirely for months afterward? This phenomenon creates a peculiar temporal pattern where the brain seems to oscillate between heightened states of false recognition and complete normalcy, as if some internal mechanism is turned up to maximum sensitivity before gradually dimming back to baseline perception. During these clusters, a person might walk into a coffee shop and feel the strange familiarity wash over them, then experience the exact same sensation again when entering their office building the following day, and once more when sitting in their dentist's waiting room, each instance feeling equally authentic and equally impossible. The psychological explanation for this clustering appears rooted in attention and stress cycles rather than anything supernatural, as research suggests that anxiety, fatigue, and divided attention can amplify the brain's tendency to misfire its memory recognition systems, creating more frequent false matches between current experiences and vague recollections. When you're tired or mentally preoccupied, your brain becomes less efficient at properly tagging new memories, and simultaneously more prone to generating spurious connections between current sensory input and stored patterns, which means high-stress periods naturally produce more instances of déjà vu simply because your neural filters are not functioning optimally. Yet despite our understanding of this mechanism, the clustering effect persists as one of those normalized mysteries of consciousness that we acknowledge but rarely examine, accepting that our minds operate in these cyclical patterns of heightened sensitivity and then reset, much like any biological system cycling through periods of load and recovery. What makes déjà vu clustering particularly intriguing is that these cycles seem to follow no predictable schedule. You cannot simply rest more or reduce stress and expect the waves to cease, suggesting that the phenomenon may be tied to deeper rhythms of how memory consolidation and retrieval systems naturally oscillate over time. In this way, déjà vu clusters become a window into the brain's hidden architecture, revealing that consciousness itself may operate in rhythmic tides rather than as a steady, constant stream. These tidal patterns might explain why certain life transitions, moving to a new city, starting a job, entering a relationship, seem to trigger particularly intense clustering phases, as if the brain is recalibrating its entire reference library and temporarily misfires more frequently in the process of reorganizing what it knows about the world. Perhaps this is why people who undergo major life changes, a divorce, a career shift, a relocation across continents, often report their most intense clustering episodes, as though the brain's attempt to integrate fundamentally new circumstances into its existing frameworks creates a temporary cascade of misfirings, a necessary friction in the process of becoming someone slightly different than who you were before. And in this light, déjà vu clusters become not glitches to be solved, but rather evidence that the mind is doing exactly what it should, struggling, recalibrating, and temporarily misfiring as it works to make sense of a fundamentally altered reality, which suggests that the uncanny sensation itself might be less a sign of something wrong and more a sign of something profound happening beneath the surface of awareness. Have you ever thought of a particular song, turned on the radio at precisely that moment, and heard it playing? Perhaps you were humming a melody in your head during your commute, switched on your car stereo, and the exact track you were thinking about began pouring through the speakers. This phenomenon has become so commonplace in modern experience that many people report it happening repeatedly throughout their lives, creating a sense that some invisible force is orchestrating these moments of perfect synchronicity. The experience feels almost supernatural, as though your thoughts have somehow reached out into the radio waves and manifested your desired song into reality, collapsing the distance between your internal mental state and the external broadcasting world. The mechanism behind this apparent miracle is far more mundane than it initially appears. Radio stations operate on rigid programming schedules, and popular songs rotate through their playlists with remarkable regularity throughout each day. A song that receives heavy airplay might be broadcast somewhere between 40 and 80 times daily across a single station, meaning that at any given hour, there exists a reasonably high probability that the track will be playing if you happen to tune in at a random moment. Additionally, the songs we think about are typically already familiar to us, songs we have heard frequently, songs that represent shared cultural moments, and this familiarity creates a cognitive bias where we are naturally more likely to think about music that is already saturated throughout our media environment. When we finally do encounter the song on the radio, our brains immediately register the coincidence and cement it into memory, while conveniently forgetting the hundreds of times we thought of songs that never appeared. Yet despite understanding this perfectly rational explanation, the sensation persists undiminished in our cultural consciousness, and we continue to experience these moments with wonder and mild bewilderment, treating them as small magical events in an otherwise ordinary day, never fully integrating the logical understanding into our intuitive experience. Perhaps this persistent enchantment reveals something deeper about human nature, our yearning to find meaning and connection in a universe that often feels random and indifferent, and our willingness to preserve a sense of wonder even when we fully comprehend the mechanics beneath it. In this way, song radio timing becomes less about defying probability and more about our fundamental need to construct narratives of meaning from the ordinary moments of our lives, transforming a statistical inevitability into a personal message from the universe, reminding us that magic need not be real to feel profoundly true. This willingness to mythologize the mundane might explain why we rarely question these coincidences in the moment. We are too busy savoring the feeling of being seen by the universe, and why even after reading explanations like this one, we will likely still experience a flutter of inexplicable joy the next time we hear an anticipated song materialize from our speakers, choosing the narrative of synchronicity over the certainty of statistics. And perhaps that is not a flaw in our thinking, but rather a feature, a small, harmless rebellion against a world that demands we constantly choose efficiency and logic over the delicious irrationality of feeling specially chosen. A rebellion we all deserve to indulge in whenever a familiar melody finds us at exactly the right moment. After all, in a world increasingly dominated by algorithmic playlists that seem to know us better than we know ourselves, these spontaneous radio moments remain one of the last bastions of genuine surprise, where fate ends. Have you ever found yourself thinking about a particular person, concept, or question, and then opened a book entirely at random, only to have your eyes land on a passage that seems to speak directly to that exact thought, as though the universe had conspired to deliver you a message precisely when you needed it most? This phenomenon occurs with surprising regularity in the lives of countless individuals who describe the experience with a sense of wonder and inexplicable synchronicity. Yet the mechanism behind it is far more straightforward than the emotional resonance might suggest. When you open a book randomly with a question or concern already occupying your mind, you are essentially priming your brain to recognize relevance in whatever text appears before you, a process psychologists refer to as confirmation bias combined with the vast applicability of language itself. Most books, particularly those dealing with human experience, philosophy, spirituality, or literature, contain passages sufficiently abstract and universal that they can be interpreted as meaningful to almost any concern a reader brings to them. The human brain is remarkably skilled at pattern recognition and at retrofitting meaning onto ambiguous information, so when you read a sentence about loss, growth, uncertainty, or connection, your mind automatically draws connections to your current emotional state, convincing you of a deeper significance. Additionally, if you repeat this experiment numerous times throughout your life, The occasions when the random passage seems relevant will stand out in your memory with crystalline clarity, while the many instances when you opened a book and found nothing remotely applicable simply fade away into obscurity, creating a survivorship bias that makes the coincidence seem far more frequent and improbable than it actually is. What makes this phenomenon particularly enduring is that the experience of receiving what feels like a personal message from the universe provides genuine psychological comfort, and the explanation of cognitive bias, while accurate, somehow diminishes neither the emotional impact nor the value of the moment itself, allowing us to continue finding profound meaning in random words even as we understand the mechanisms that create that meaning. Perhaps this is ultimately the point, that the truth of causation matters less than the truth of connection, and whether the universe conspires to speak to us or we conspire to hear meaning in silence, the act of listening, of pausing long enough to notice what a random page might offer, remains a quiet form of wisdom in itself. In this sense, the random book opening becomes less about prediction or divine intervention and more about an act of intentional receptivity, a deliberate pause in which we grant ourselves permission to be moved by language, to let our guard down, and to acknowledge that sometimes we need external words to give shape to our internal struggles, even if we ourselves provided the lens through which we interpret them. And in that way, the random book opening becomes less a trick of fate and more an act of self-compassion, a permission slip we give ourselves to slow down, to listen, and to trust that somewhere in the vast landscape of human expression, a stranger's words might illuminate what we've been struggling to articulate alone. This is why the random book opening endures not as a supernatural occurrence, but as a deeply human ritual, a moment where the boundary between seeking and finding dissolves, where we transform the act of opening pages into an act of opening ourselves, and where the book becomes less important than what we bring to it. Throughout history, there have been countless documented cases where significant numbers of births appear to cluster around specific astronomical events, particularly when planets align in rare configurations across our night sky, creating what some refer to as astrological conjunctions or grand alignments. During these periods, hospitals and maternity wards report unusual patterns in labor inductions, natural births, and complications, with some facilities noting that their delivery rooms experience unexpected surges in activity precisely when Jupiter aligns with Saturn or when Venus crosses particular celestial thresholds, leading parents and medical professionals alike to wonder if there exists some mysterious cosmic influence governing the precise moment new life enters our world. The psychological mechanism underpinning this phenomenon operates on several interconnected levels, beginning with our profound human tendency toward pattern recognition, which evolutionarily served us well in survival situations, but now causes us to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated events, particularly when those events carry emotional weight like the birth of a child. Additionally, confirmation bias plays a substantial role, as we readily remember and recount the remarkable instances where a birth coincided with a planetary alignment, while we forget the thousands of births occurring during perfectly ordinary cosmic weather, thus creating a distorted narrative of cosmic influence where none genuinely exists. The medical explanation is considerably more mundane, suggesting that any perceived clustering of births during astronomical events can be attributed to statistical randomness, lunar cycles that genuinely do influence tidal forces and potentially some biological rhythms, and the simple fact that hospitals maintain accurate records that allow us to retrospectively search for patterns that were never actually present in the original data. What makes this coincidence particularly persistent in our collective consciousness is our deep-seated desire to believe that major life events are somehow cosmically significant, that the universe itself acknowledged and orchestrated the arrival of our children through celestial choreography, and this romantic notion persists even among those with scientific literacy, suggesting that certain human longings transcend rational understanding and will endure regardless of how thoroughly we explain the actual mechanisms at work. Yet this enduring belief also reveals something profound about how we construct meaning in an uncertain world. By attributing our children's births to cosmic events, we transform random biological timing into a narrative where they arrive at precisely the moment the universe intended, offering comfort in the face of life's fundamental unpredictability, and suggesting that even in a vast, indifferent cosmos, their existence carries a deeper significance than chance alone would permit. This impulse to find cosmic meaning in birth timing appears across cultures, from ancient Babylonian astrologers charting celestial events to modern parents checking their child's birth chart, suggesting that the human need to contextualize our origins within a grander celestial narrative may be as fundamental as the biological drive to reproduce itself. What remains scientifically unproven, however, is whether this universal pattern of seeking celestial significance in birth timing reflects merely a quirk of human psychology, or whether it points to something deeper about our intuitive sense of connection to cosmic rhythms that modern science has yet to fully measure or understand. Throughout history, there have been remarkable instances where notable individuals, particularly astronomers and scientists who dedicated their lives to studying celestial phenomena, have passed away in the very year that a famous comet returned to Earth's vicinity, creating an eerie synchronicity that has captured the imagination of chroniclers and storytellers for centuries. The most famous example involves Edmund Halley, the brilliant English astronomer and mathematician who calculated the orbital period of what would become known as Halley's Comet, predicting its return in 1758, yet he himself died in 1742, 16 years before witnessing his prediction come to fruition. Though this particular case is often misremembered or conflated with other instances where observers actually did perish during a comet's appearance. What makes these coincidences psychologically compelling is the human tendency to forge meaningful connections between celestial events and mortality, particularly when the person involved had spent their entire existence studying the heavens and tracking these wandering stars across the cosmos, creating an almost poetic narrative where life and professional obsession intersect with cosmic cycles. Our brains are extraordinarily sophisticated pattern recognition machines, evolved over millions of years to detect connections and relationships in the natural world. Yet this same capability can cause us to perceive intentional significance in purely random occurrences, especially when those occurrences involve the dramatic backdrop of astronomy and death, two subjects that have always held profound emotional weight for humanity. The persistence of these comet death narratives suggests something deeper about how we construct meaning from the universe, how we want celestial events to matter in relation to individual human lives, and how we sometimes preserve historical facts through embellishment and selective memory, transforming ordinary deaths into cosmic correspondences that feel far more significant than the random timing that actually underlies them, reminding us that even in an age of scientific understanding, we remain drawn to the idea that the heavens somehow mark human significance. Perhaps it is this yearning for cosmic significance that explains why we remember the deaths of astronomers during comet returns with such clarity and persistence, while forgetting the countless other scientists who passed away on ordinary days, their departures unmarked by any celestial fanfare, suggesting that our historical memory itself is shaped less by what actually happened than by what feels like it should have happened. Yet this selective storytelling serves a purpose beyond mere entertainment. It reflects our deep-seated need to believe that the universe pays attention to human achievement, that a life spent unlocking celestial secrets might be honored by a final cosmic alignment, even if the historical record tells us that most astronomers simply grew old and died on unremarkable Tuesday afternoons. Their contributions to science, enduring long after the comets that outlived them had vanished beyond the reach of human telescopes. In this way, the mythology of comet deaths becomes a form of secular immortality, a narrative device through which we elevate human lives to the status of cosmic events, ensuring that certain astronomers are remembered not merely for their calculations and discoveries, but for the poetic symmetry of their final years, even when that symmetry exists primarily in our collective imagination rather than in the astronomical record itself. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, in the remote Siberian wilderness near the Tunguska region, an explosion of extraordinary magnitude flattened approximately 80 million trees across an area of roughly 2,000 square kilometers. Yet this cataclysmic event occurred in one of the most sparsely populated regions on Earth, and the remarkable coincidence lies not merely in the explosion itself, but in the precise timing of when it happened. For had this impact occurred just a few hours later in the day or at a different time of year, the consequences for human civilization could have been dramatically different. And this timing coincidence has captivated scientists and historians for over a century as they contemplate how fortunate our species was that this cosmic event struck when and where it did. The explosion, almost certainly caused by an asteroid or comet entering Earth's atmosphere, released energy equivalent to 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, a force so tremendous that it would have obliterated any major city instantaneously had the impact zone been located over Moscow, London, or any other densely populated metropolitan center. Yet on that fateful morning, virtually no human observers witnessed the blast directly. And the nearest settlements were far enough away that casualties remained minimal despite the unimaginable power of the detonation. What makes this timing so psychologically compelling to our minds is the way we instinctively calculate probability and consequence, recognizing that the universe operates according to physical laws that care nothing for human existence, and our brains naturally engage in counterfactual thinking, imagining alternative scenarios where the asteroid arrived hours earlier or later, where it struck a populated region instead, where human history might have been utterly transformed by this one random cosmic event. We are drawn to this story because it exemplifies the profound vulnerability of human civilization to forces beyond our control, and we find ourselves simultaneously relieved and unsettled by the recognition that our survival depends partly upon chance encounters with celestial mechanics that operate on scales far grander than human timescales. And this duality creates a compelling psychological narrative that persists in popular imagination despite the statistical reality that such impacts follow predictable orbital patterns and collision probabilities that are well understood by modern astronomy. The Tunguska event serves as a constant reminder of our cosmic insignificance while simultaneously reassuring us that we have been spared, at least so far, from catastrophic consequences. And this paradoxical comfort has allowed the story to remain deeply embedded in human consciousness as a meditation on fate, chance, and the thin thread upon which our continued existence hangs in an indifferent universe. Yet this same capacity for imagining disaster has also motivated humanity to develop asteroid detection systems and planetary defense strategies, transforming the Tunguska event from a mere historical curiosity into a catalyst for scientific vigilance, reminding us that while we cannot control the cosmos, we need not remain entirely passive in the face of its dangers. Modern monitoring systems like NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office now track thousands of near-Earth objects, a direct legacy of lessons learned from Tunguska, demonstrating how historical contingency can reshape our collective future by transforming passive observation into active preparation for the cosmic uncertainties that await us. Throughout human history, we have developed an almost supernatural awareness of celestial objects that pass near Earth, and the remarkable coincidence lies not in the asteroids themselves, but in how frequently we discover them only after they have already swept past our planet, sometimes coming far closer than we initially realized. Consider the asteroid that passed within 14,000 miles of Earth in 2011, closer than the distance to some of our own communication satellites, yet was detected only 3 days before its closest approach, a discovery that emerged almost by accident when astronomers happened to be scanning that particular region of sky. The psychological mechanism behind our fascination with these near misses operates on multiple levels, beginning with our deep ancestral awareness that objects falling from the sky have historically posed existential threats to our species, a concern that is validated by the fossil record showing that major asteroid impacts have indeed caused mass extinction events throughout Earth's geological history. We find ourselves caught in a peculiar cognitive bind where we simultaneously acknowledge the genuine danger these cosmic projectiles represent, while also feeling somewhat sheltered by the sheer vastness of space, which makes a direct collision seem statistically unlikely even as we discover evidence of increasingly close encounters. The narration of near misses has become normalized in contemporary discourse, with news outlets regularly reporting on asteroids that pass within a certain distance of Earth, distances that in cosmic terms are genuinely close, but in human terms seem comfortably remote, creating a paradox where we can acknowledge real danger while remaining psychologically unconcerned. Our detection systems have improved dramatically over recent decades, meaning we now identify far more near misses than ever before. Yet this improvement in detection capability often feels indistinguishable from an increase in actual near misses, leading us to wonder if dangerous asteroids are becoming more common or if we have simply become better at noticing them. The coincidence deepens when we reflect on how many asteroids may have passed even closer to Earth throughout history without ever being detected at all, a sobering thought that suggests our sense of cosmic safety may rest partly on ignorance rather than actual security. and this realization sits quietly beneath our otherwise calm acceptance of our place in a solar system filled with drifting rocks that occasionally wander into our neighborhood. Yet perhaps this uncertainty itself serves a function, maintaining a productive tension between vigilance and complacency that has allowed our species to both take asteroid detection seriously enough to fund monitoring systems while remaining psychologically free enough to continue building civilizations and planning futures. As if we collectively understand that excessive anxiety about invisible threats would paralyze us more effectively than any asteroid ever could. This delicate balance may itself be the greatest coincidence of all, that we have developed just enough awareness of cosmic threats to protect ourselves, yet not so much awareness that the knowledge becomes paralyzing, suggesting that our species possesses an almost intuitive wisdom about which dangers deserve our attention, and which ones we are better served by acknowledging only in the abstract. We see this wisdom reflected in the fact that despite possessing detailed knowledge of past extinction events, we do not live in constant dread, but instead channel our understanding into practical measures like NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office, which monitors potentially hazardous asteroids with the sun. In the 1950s, physicist Winfried Otto Schumann discovered that the Earth's magnetic field oscillates at a frequency of approximately 7.83 Hz, a rhythm that pulses beneath our feet in the electromagnetic space between the planet's surface and its ionosphere, creating what researchers began calling the Schumann resonance. This discovery led to an intriguing observation that this frequency happens to fall within the same range as human brainwave activity, specifically within the alpha and theta wave bands that correspond to relaxed, meditative, and deeply focused mental states. From this scientific foundation emerged an elaborate contemporary belief system, suggesting that exposure to the Schumann resonance frequency promotes healing, enhances consciousness, reduces stress, and aligns human physiology with the Earth's natural electromagnetic rhythm in ways that can allegedly improve sleep quality, mental clarity, and overall well-being. The mechanism that drives this belief relies on the principle of resonance, the same phenomenon by which tuning forks vibrate sympathetically when exposed to matching frequencies, and by extension, the idea that biological systems might similarly synchronize with environmental electromagnetic frequencies in beneficial ways. However, the scientific evidence supporting these claims remains remarkably thin and contested among serious researchers, with numerous controlled studies failing to demonstrate measurable physiological effects beyond placebo. Yet the belief persists with remarkable resilience in wellness communities, meditation circles, and alternative health practitioners who continue to market Schumann resonance generators and frequency apps as gateways to enhanced human potential. What makes this particular coincidence so psychologically compelling is that it bridges the gap between verifiable scientific discovery and human aspiration for harmony with nature, creating a narrative that feels intuitively true even when empirical testing suggests otherwise, allowing millions of people worldwide to comfortably maintain faith in the concept despite the absence of robust clinical validation. Simply because the underlying logic feels resonant with our deeper desire to believe that the universe operates according to elegant, interconnected principles designed for our well-being. This pattern, where scientific legitimacy becomes a launching pad for unfalsifiable wellness claims, reflects a broader human tendency to retrofit objective facts into subjective meaning-making narratives, transforming a genuine electromagnetic phenomenon into a kind of modern secular spirituality that asks believers to trust intuition and anecdotal experience over the rigorous skepticism that science itself demands. And perhaps most tellingly, this phenomenon demonstrates how the human mind's hunger for meaningful connection to the natural world can override its capacity for critical evaluation, transforming a neutral scientific observation into a reassuring mythology that promises us we are not separate from nature but fundamentally entangled with it in ways that serve our highest interests. Yet in this very yearning lies both the vulnerability and the resilience of human consciousness. We are creatures who need to believe in invisible connections, in frequencies that harmonize body with cosmos, and perhaps that need itself is as real and worthy of examination as any electromagnetic measurement, even if the mechanisms we imagine turn out to be less literal than we hope. The Schumann resonance thus becomes a mirror reflecting not the Earth's electromagnetic truth, but our own psychological architecture, our profound need to dissolve the boundary between self and world, to find meaning in the spaces bet. Imagine a scientist conducting an experiment at the subatomic level, measuring the behavior of electrons or photons as they move through space, and discovering something that seems to defy rational explanation. The act of observing the particles actually changes their behavior, as though the universe itself is responding to the act of measurement itself. The particles behave one way when measured and another way entirely when left alone, which creates a profound paradox that has puzzled physicists for over a century since the foundational principles of quantum mechanics were first discovered. The observer effect describes how the very act of observation influences the outcome of an experiment, collapsing possibilities into a single reality, and this phenomenon persists even after countless rigorous experiments have confirmed its validity within the quantum realm. The mechanism underlying this peculiar occurrence rests on the fundamental nature of how we measure at the smallest scales of reality, where the act of measurement itself requires interaction with the system being observed, and any interaction at quantum scales inevitably disturbs the system in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled with perfect precision. When a scientist attempts to measure the position of an electron, for instance, they must bombard it with photons or other particles, and these interactions necessarily alter the electron's momentum and trajectory, which means the measurement process itself becomes inseparable from the phenomenon being measured. The philosophical weight of this discovery suggested something almost mystical, as if consciousness or observation held some special role in creating physical reality, yet the truth appears more nuanced, rooted in the technical limitations and mathematical principles that govern existence at quantum scales rather than in any supernatural connection between mind and matter. We have normalized this astonishing principle by integrating it into the standard framework of quantum mechanics, teaching it in universities and incorporating it into our calculations and predictions, even though it remains fundamentally counterintuitive to our everyday experience of a world that seems to exist independently of whether anyone is watching it. Yet this acceptance of the observer effect represents a profound shift in how we understand reality itself, from a universe of fixed, objective facts existing independent of measurement to one where the act of inquiry fundamentally shapes what we can know, suggesting that at the deepest level, observer and observed are not truly separate entities, but rather interdependent aspects of a single, unified quantum system. This reconceptualization has profound implications for how we interpret experiments across disciplines, from the double-slit experiment that reveals wave-particle duality to quantum entanglement where measuring one particle instantaneously affects its distant counterpart, reminding us that the boundary between subject and object, knower and known, may be far more permeable than classical physics ever suggested. Beyond the laboratory, this principle challenges us to reconsider whether any objective reality exists independent of measurement, inviting us to contemplate whether the universe itself is participatory in nature, where consciousness and physical reality engage in a fundamental dialogue that generates the phenomena we observe, rather than merely recording pre-existing facts about a world indifferent to our inquiries. Yet even as we embrace this participatory model, we must remain cautious about overinterpreting what observation means, for the quantum realm operates according to mathematical laws that care nothing for human consciousness or intent only for the physical eye. Consider the remarkable and unsettling phenomenon of wrongful convictions being overturned by DNA evidence, where individuals spend decades imprisoned for crimes they did not commit, only to be exonerated on dates that hold unexpected personal significance in their lives. There exists a documented pattern where exonerations have occurred on birthdays, anniversaries of the original crime, or other meaningful dates that seem almost too coincidental to be mere chance, creating a psychological narrative of cosmic justice or karmic alignment in the minds of those who observe these cases. When Anthony Ray Hinton walked free after spending 30 years on death row in Alabama, it occurred on a date that held particular resonance with his family's history, and similar patterns have emerged in other high-profile exonerations, where the release date seemed to carry significance beyond the legal paperwork itself. The human mind, when presented with such cases, naturally seeks meaning and pattern in the dates involved, because our brains are wired to construct narratives that suggest order and purpose in a universe that often feels chaotic and unjust. and this tendency becomes particularly powerful when the narrative involves redemption and the correction of a terrible wrong. We retroactively assign meaning to these dates, recognizing them as milestones and markers of transformation, though statistically, exonerations occur on thousands of different dates throughout the year, and we simply remember and emphasize the ones that carry apparent significance while forgetting the countless others that fell on unremarkable dates. The persistence of this perception reflects our deep human need to believe that suffering, when it finally ends, carries with it some element of poetic justice or destined timing, that the universe acknowledges and validates our pain through the timing of our release, even though the actual date of exoneration is determined by legal procedures, case backlogs, and bureaucratic schedules rather than any cosmic awareness of personal importance. Yet in our search for meaning, we overlook that the true significance of an exoneration date lies not in its numerical alignment with other events, but in its representation of a systemic correction, a moment when evidence and truth finally supersede conviction and assumption, regardless of whether that moment arrives on a Tuesday in March or on a date that numerologically mirrors the accused's birth year. This reframing from coincidence to consequence reminds us that the real power of an exoneration date lies not in what it symbolizes about fate, but in what it demands of us about accountability. The recognition that every day of wrongful imprisonment represents a failure of the justice system, and every exoneration, regardless of its calendar position, should compel us to examine the evidence and assumptions that led to conviction in the first place. The cases of Anthony Ray Hinton, Curtis McCarty, and countless others remind us that the date of exoneration is ultimately less important than the systematic reforms it should inspire: better preservation of evidence, more rigorous initial investigations, and a criminal justice system that treats DNA testing not as a miraculous intervention, but as a standard safeguard against the irreversible harm of wrongful conviction. Until we achieve that systemic transformation, the dates of exoneration will continue to carry weight in our collective consciousness, not because they are cosmically ordained, but because they represent the stark measure of how long justice delayed has been justice denied, and each one serves as a calendar reminder of the price we pay when our legal system fails to distinguish between guilt and innocence from the beginning. Have you ever glanced at your phone to check the time and noticed that the digits displayed form a perfect pattern, such as 111 or 222, and felt a peculiar sense of significance wash over you? Perhaps you were dialing a number and realized the sequence contained repeating digits, or you received a call and the time stamp showed a mirrored arrangement of numbers, and you found yourself pausing to acknowledge the apparent coincidence. This phenomenon of repeatedly encountering pattern digits on phones and digital displays has become remarkably common in modern life, an experience that strikes many people as far too precise to be merely accidental. The explanation for why we notice these moments so frequently lies in the fundamental architecture of human perception and selective attention. Our brains are exquisitely tuned pattern recognition machines, evolved over millions of years to detect regularities and anomalies in our environment for survival purposes, and digital number sequences present an almost irresistible target for this biological wiring. When we glance at a phone screen, we are not consciously analyzing every possible number combination, but rather our attention unconsciously filters for deviations from randomness, making symmetrical or repeating patterns leap out from the visual field with striking clarity. The mathematical reality is that repeating digit patterns are genuinely rare, appearing only briefly in each hour, yet because we check our phones dozens or even hundreds of times daily with our eyes often landing at random moments, the probability that we will occasionally catch these patterns becomes far more significant than pure chance alone would suggest. What makes this phenomenon particularly compelling is that we tend to remember the instances when we notice these patterns with crystalline clarity, while simultaneously forgetting the countless times we glance at our phones and see entirely ordinary, non-patterned numbers. This selective memory creates a cognitive bias wherein the repeating digit moments feel mysteriously overrepresented in our experience, lending them an almost supernatural quality that feels deeply personal and meaningful. We have woven these moments into our modern superstitions and spiritual practices, assigning them significance as signs or messages from the universe. Yet the mechanism remains entirely rooted in the intersection of our pattern-seeking neurology and the mathematical structure of a 24-hour clock combined with our frequent digital device interactions. Understanding this mechanism does not diminish the genuine pleasure many people experience when they catch these patterns. Rather, it illuminates how our minds create meaning from the intersection of mathematics and attention, transforming a simple coincidence into a moment that feels briefly, mysteriously, and utterly personally significant. In this way, the fleeting alignment of numbers becomes a small mirror held up to our own consciousness, revealing how readily we find patterns in randomness and construct narratives around coincidence. A tendency that, while sometimes misleading us about causality, also represents one of humanity's most powerful capacities for discovering genuine meaning and connection in an otherwise indifferent universe. Perhaps this is why we instinctively pause and acknowledge these moments with a smile or a mental note, not because we truly believe they herald something supernatural, but because we recognize in them a glimpse of our own remarkable ability to extract order from chaos, to find ourselves reflected in the mathematics of time itself. Imagine discovering that someone you know, perhaps a distant relative or a friend, lives on the exact same street address number as you, just in a different city or state, and this revelation strikes you with an almost inexplicable sense of wonder and cosmic connection. Two people separated by geography and circumstance, sharing the identical numerical designation for their homes, feels like an improbable alignment of fate, as though the universe has placed a subtle marker linking your lives together in some meaningful way. The phenomenon occurs with surprising frequency in our modern world, where millions of addresses exist across vast territories, and yet people genuinely experience moments of astonishment when they discover these numerical coincidences with someone in their social circle. You might ask your neighbor their address, or learn through casual conversation that an acquaintance lives at the same number as you, just on a different street or in a neighboring town, and immediately the mind begins searching for deeper significance in this apparent alignment. The explanation for why this seems so remarkable despite being statistically predictable lies in how our brains process numerical patterns and assign meaning to random occurrences through a well-documented cognitive phenomenon called pattern recognition. When we encounter matching numbers, our brains immediately flag them as significant because we have been evolutionarily programmed to notice patterns and connections as a survival mechanism, even when those patterns emerge purely by chance in an otherwise random universe. Address numbers are finite and cyclical, typically ranging from single digits to perhaps the thousands, meaning that in any given neighborhood or city, the same number will repeat frequently across different streets, and the probability of two people knowing each other and sharing an address number is far higher than our intuition suggests. Furthermore, we tend to notice and remember these coincidences when they occur while completely ignoring the countless instances when people we know have completely different address numbers, creating a powerful confirmation bias that makes these matches seem far more improbable and meaningful than they actually are. The human mind naturally gravitates toward narrative and causality, searching for threads of connection between events, and a matching address number provides exactly the kind of tangible, numerical evidence that feels like it should mean something, even though it is ultimately just a product of the limited range of possible numbers combined with our selective attention to favorable outcomes. We have largely normalized this phenomenon in contemporary culture, barely remarking on it in most circumstances, yet occasionally someone will express genuine surprise or delight at discovering they share an address number with someone else, as though momentarily forgetting the mathematical likelihood that ensures such matches will occur regularly whenever people compare their residential numbers. Perhaps this is precisely why the phenomenon endures as a source of mild wonder, not because it defies logic, but because it offers a harmless outlet for our need to find meaning in an indifferent world, a small, numerically justified excuse to feel briefly connected to someone through the mundane details of where we happen to live. In this way, matching street addresses join the long list of minor coincidences that punctuate our lives. The friend who texts you the moment you were thinking of them, the song that plays on the radio just as you hum its melody, reminders that we are perpetually searching for hidden order in a fundamentally chaotic existence, finding solace in these small numerical echoes that whisper. You are driving down the highway, lost in thought, when you notice something peculiar. The car in front of you has a license plate that reads 123456, or perhaps all the same numbers repeating in perfect sequence. Your heart quickens slightly, and you feel a strange sense of cosmic alignment, as though the universe has just winked at you across the expanse of asphalt and steel. You begin to wonder how rare such an occurrence truly is, and whether noticing it means something meaningful about your connection to the world around you. Within the next few hours, you notice another sequential plate, and then another, each one seeming to confirm that you have entered some peculiar state of heightened perception, where the universe is revealing its hidden patterns just for your awareness. The truth, however, is far more ordinary than our minds would like to admit. License plates in most regions contain at least 6 characters, typically a combination of numbers and letters, which means there are millions of possible combinations in circulation in any given area. When we encounter a sequential arrangement like 1, 2, 3, 4, or even something like double-digit repeats, we are not witnessing improbable chance, but rather simple mathematics playing out exactly as it should. The human mind possesses an extraordinary capacity for pattern recognition, a survival mechanism that once helped our ancestors identify predators in tall grass and potential food sources in the wilderness. This same mental apparatus, however, has not evolved to intuitively understand probability and statistics in the modern world. When we see something that appears orderly or unusual, we tend to weight that observation far more heavily than all the thousands of completely ordinary license plates we have seen and instantly forgotten. We notice the sequential plate and commit it to memory, but we do not equally notice and commit to memory the hundreds of random alphanumeric combinations we pass without a second glance. This cognitive bias, known as selective attention or the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, creates a false impression that sequential plates are far more common than they actually are. We begin to construct narratives around these sightings, interpreting them as synchronicity or signs from the universe, when in reality we are simply experiencing the inevitable output of a large set of random data. The peculiar thing about license plate sequences is how completely normalized this experience has become in modern culture. We have largely accepted that noticing patterns means something without ever seriously interrogating whether the pattern itself is statistically improbable or merely inevitable given the sheer volume of plates we encounter. This acceptance persists despite the absence of any rational mechanism by which a license plate sequence could be causally related to our thoughts, our day, or our future. And yet, the moment we see one, we cannot help but feel that momentary sense of connection, that brief whisper of meaning in an otherwise mechanistic universe. Perhaps this is not a flaw in human perception, but rather evidence of our deep need to find meaning in randomness, a need so fundamental that we will manufacture significance from the innocent collision of numbers and letters, transforming the mundane machinery of chance into a personal message from the cosmos itself. And in that transformation, we glimpse something essential about human consciousness itself. Our refusal to accept a world of pure indifference, and our insistence on knitting together the scattered threads of experience into a tapestry of personal significance, however threadbare the evidence may be. Across the world, millions of people report a peculiar experience where they consistently glance at their clocks, phones, or digital displays precisely at 11 minutes past 11 in the morning or evening, and this happens with such frequency that it feels like more than mere chance. The person might be in the middle of a conversation, driving down a highway, sitting in a waiting room, or absorbed in some other activity when something inexplicably draws their attention to the time, and there it is again, the repeating digits staring back at them. This phenomenon has become so widespread that entire online communities have formed around the documentation of these moments, with people sharing their experiences of seeing 11:11 on clocks, license plates, receipts, and addresses with an almost spiritual reverence. The experience feels significant, almost like the universe is trying to communicate something important or that they are being guided by forces beyond their understanding, and this sensation creates a lasting impression that reinforces the pattern in their memory. The explanation for this phenomenon lies firmly in the domain of cognitive psychology, specifically in our brain's extraordinary ability to notice patterns and our tendency toward selective attention and confirmation bias. When you become aware of a pattern, your mind automatically begins scanning your environment for additional instances of that same pattern, which means that once you have noticed 11:11 once, your brain will unconsciously seek it out repeatedly throughout your daily life. The human brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition machine that has evolved to prioritize survival, And in the modern world, this means we are hypervigilant to repeating sequences, symmetrical numbers, and other organized structures that stand out from random noise. Digital clocks present these perfect opportunities for pattern recognition because they display numbers multiple times throughout every single day, offering countless opportunities for coincidental alignment. Additionally, confirmation bias ensures that when you do happen to see 1111, you remember it vividly and attach significance to it, while the thousands of other times you look at clocks and see different times simply fade from memory without leaving any impression whatsoever. Despite understanding the psychological mechanisms that explain this phenomenon completely and rationally, the experience persists with undiminished intensity for those who have developed awareness of it, and many people continue to feel a sense of wonder or meaning when they encounter these repeating numbers regardless of how thoroughly they comprehend the underlying psychology. This reveals something fundamental about human consciousness, that rationality and emotion operate on different levels, and that knowing why something happens does not necessarily diminish the subjective experience of it or prevent us from assigning personal meaning to essentially random events that our minds have been primed to notice. Perhaps this is why so many people report that their 11 moments coincide with periods of personal reflection or decision-making, not because the universe is sending coded messages, but because our heightened awareness during vulnerable times makes us more receptive to noticing the patterns our brains have already primed us to see, transforming a simple numerical coincidence into a meaningful anchor point for our own introspection. In this way, the 11 phenomenon becomes less about external communication and more about our own internal need to find meaning in the patterns we encounter, a deeply human tendency that serves us well in making sense of an otherwise chaotic world, even when that sense of order is lar. Have you ever glanced down at a receipt after a purchase and noticed something peculiar about the sequence of numbers printed at the top or bottom, perhaps observing that the digits seem to follow an almost rhythmic progression, or that certain numbers repeat in ways that feel far too deliberate to be random, and then found yourself wondering whether the cash register system was somehow designed with your transaction in mind? Or whether you stumbled upon something genuinely remarkable that defies the ordinary distribution of numerical sequences. This phenomenon represents one of the most subtle yet persistent coincidences people encounter in their daily lives, emerging from the intersection of our psychological tendency to seek patterns and the genuine mathematical properties of sequential numbering systems used across retail environments worldwide. When you examine receipt numbers closely, you're actually observing the output of deterministic systems that increment by fixed amounts with each transaction. And because these systems process thousands of transactions daily, they naturally generate sequences that, when viewed in isolation, can appear to contain meaningful patterns, repetitions, or symmetries that would seem astronomically unlikely if generated truly at random. The human brain is extraordinarily attuned to pattern recognition because this ability conferred significant survival advantages throughout our evolutionary history, making us hyper-aware of clustering, sequences, and repetitions even when those patterns emerge inevitably from mathematical processes rather than from intentional design or cosmic significance. Receipt number patterns persist in our consciousness as meaningful coincidences precisely because we typically only examine a handful of receipts in any given period, creating a biased sample where we notice the occasional sequence that aligns with our expectations while entirely ignoring the vast majority of receipts, whose numbers appear completely unremarkable and therefore unworthy of our attention or reflection. We have normalized these patterns to such a degree that we rarely question why we should expect anything other than sequential numbers from a system specifically designed to track transactions in order. And yet the moment we perceive what feels like a special arrangement of digits, we momentarily suspend this logical understanding and experience a flutter of inexplicable wonder at what our minds have constructed as meaningful amid the mechanical progression of commerce. Perhaps this is why receipt numbers fascinate us more than other numerical sequences we encounter daily. They represent one of the few times we actively pause to examine data that was never meant for contemplation, transforming utilitarian documentation into a canvas for our pattern-seeking minds to project meaning onto the ordinary machinery of commerce. Yet in this very act of transformation, where we elevate a simple transaction identifier into a subject worthy of wonder, we reveal something profound about human consciousness itself. our compulsive need to find meaning in the mundane, and our capacity to experience genuine awe at the intersection of mathematics and daily life, even when we consciously understand the mechanics at work. This capacity to find wonder in the mechanical reveals that coincidences themselves may be less about the universe conspiring in our favor and more about the universe providing us with an endless supply of raw material, numberless receipts, infinite moments, upon which we can practice the distinctly human art of meaning-making, transforming the arbitrary into the significant through the simple act of paying attention. Imagine you are examining a dataset of naturally occurring numbers, whether they come from river lengths, population sizes, financial records, or the distances between stars, and you begin to notice something peculiar unfolding before your eyes. The number 1 appears as the first digit far more frequently than you would expect if the digits were distributed randomly and equally, showing up roughly 30% of the time, while the number 9 appears as a first digit in less than 5% of cases. This pattern, known as Benford's law, seems to defy our intuitive sense of how randomness should operate, yet it emerges consistently across an astonishing variety of real-world measurements and counts, from the populations of cities to the values listed in corporate financial statements to the half-lives of radioactive elements. When mathematicians and scientists first documented this phenomenon rigorously in the 20th century, they were examining phenomena that had been occurring naturally throughout human history without anyone truly understanding why such a consistent pattern would emerge from the chaos of reality itself. The explanation lies in the logarithmic nature of how numbers are distributed across different scales and magnitudes, because as quantities grow exponentially from small numbers toward larger ones, the intervals between each digit's range become proportionally larger, meaning there is simply more numerical territory between 1 and 2 than between 8 and 9. Our minds expect uniformity and equal probability, assuming that if there are 9 possible digits to begin with, each should appear with roughly equal frequency. Yet we forget that numbers do not exist in a vacuum, but rather within scales and ranges determined by the actual phenomena being measured, and these scales themselves follow logarithmic progressions that favor smaller leading digits. Despite understanding this mathematical principle intellectually, Benford's law continues to surprise us because it contradicts our everyday experience with human-generated numbers, which tend toward more uniform distributions precisely because we consciously or unconsciously avoid the patterns that nature produces. Yet when auditors and investigators seek to identify fraudulent financial records, they explicitly look for deviations from Benford's law. Recognizing that human fabrication creates unnatural uniformity, proving that even in our attempts to hide from natural patterns, we inadvertently reveal ourselves through our failure to replicate the subtle logarithmic reality that underlies the universe's numerical foundation. This paradox reveals something profound about the nature of authenticity itself. That truth, when left to unfold according to natural laws, bears a mathematical signature that human intention cannot replicate, and thus Benford's law stands as a kind of fingerprint of reality, a test by which we can distinguish the genuine evolution of systems from the artificial constructs we impose upon them. Yet this insight extends beyond fraud detection into something more philosophical. It suggests that reality itself maintains an internal consistency that resists our efforts to falsify it, and that by learning to recognize the mathematical signatures of authenticity, we gain not just a tool for verification, but a deeper understanding of how the universe distinguishes between what genuinely emerges from its processes and what we merely pretend into existence. In this sense, Benford's law becomes a mirror held up to the boundary between human intention and natural emergence, reminding us that the universe leaves traces of its authenticity in places we least expect to find them, and that wisdom often consists in learning to read these subtle signatures.